You're listening to Funk with Fate, a show about being a body and cultivating pleasurable relationships with everything. And I'm your host, Mackenzie McCormick. This podcast will explore how our embodied experiences connect us to the world through astrology, philosophy, dance, magic, and anything that invigorates our aliveness. What makes us feel the most alive? Big inhale, big exhale. Now let's get grooving.
Hello, Hottie, and welcome to the show. Right now, it is about 1:30 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday, April 17th, 2024. And at this moment in time, Leo is rising over the horizon. I'm Mackenzie McCormick, and I'm so honored to introduce our guest today. One of my favorite people, one of the besties, Hugh Tran, is on the podcast with us today to talk about so many things that we're going to go all over the place today, and I'm so excited. Hugh, please introduce yourself to the podcast and tell the people all about you.
Yeah, I'm just super excited to be on. My name is Hugh Tran. I think a lot of y'all maybe potentially know me. I'm an artist, designer, astrologer, currently based in Fulton, California, and yeah, I think uh I guess look that's it. Sorry, I haven't like spoken to people generally because I've been hermiting, my social skills may be lacking. So sorry about that.
No apologies needed. You are an amazing human, and it's really an honor to have you on the show because you have been like not super public and open lately, and so this is a big
Yeah.
moment for you and for me as well to have you on and to be watching you emerge in such a beautiful way. Yeah, I'm super thrilled. Um, you are a designer. You have made this amazing thing that I use, that a lot of people use regularly. In fact, some people probably interact with it daily. You should talk about your font.
Yes. So Fusus is
The
the
correct
font
pronunciation
that
I just learned.
yeah, it's I really I don't care how people pronounce it. Like people say physis or whatever, but like it's the Greek because like the Y is like the upsilon, the letter upsilon in Greek, so it has kind of like the French U sound if you want to be pretentious. But yeah, Fusus is the name of the app, or not the app, the font. I think about it in software terms because when I interact, as a type designer, I think about the tool as like a digital tool, right? And that was actually one of the reasons why I created it in the first place. Because of course, with a lot of the things I design, at first it starts out because I need it, because when I was like first getting into astrology, I had all these ideas about designing astrology related graphics, and I just didn't see a lot of fonts available for astrology. And if they existed, because there are like some popular ones out there, they just, I didn't appreciate them the most. They didn't look up to par with what I feel like, modern day fonts, what we expect. So I, kind of set out designing a few glyphs, and I shared it randomly on Twitter because that was during the time of like around 2020 where everyone was at home, and
Yeah,
so when I
definitely
shared
worth
it on
it on the Astro Twitter. Yeah,
yeah,
like shout out to
yeah.
the Astro Twitter times during then because it connected us, and
Oh
then
yeah.
we
Like,
met in
oh, I-
person at Norwalk. That's the story, is that you always meet at Norwalk. But
oh yeah, 100%.
always. But yeah, I remember you like starting to share these and like people giving feedback and seeing it develop.
Yeah, and I felt like it was kind of like this communication, this exchange between like me and like I guess my growing audience. It's so weird to think of yourself as somebody who's like known because I was just like sharing random shit, on like my Twitter, And so when I shared just even the preliminary stages of like Fusus, at the time it wasn't even named, it like that post blew up. It got something like 4,000 something likes. So something hit me and made me realize, okay, I think people actually want this, So I think I that entire year I really, really focused on honing my type skills, getting, my production skills up to par so that I could actually turn this into like a thing, like an actual product that people could use. And I added even like points, because I want to be inclusive. I included all the points that, like the trans-Neptunians, the fixed stars, like the Penian fixed stars. I just wanted like something that was a completely robust set of
Mm.
glyphs for anyone who has an interest in astrology. Right. So that was the original intention for Fusus, and I released it and it was like a huge success. It's now been used, I think, on several apps that have existed on the App Store. I think like Cuss, I remember being one of them. I think Kira and like her team, and some of the artists. I've just seen a lot of different astrologers at this point use it. I've seen it. Some people use it on like Astro Dice. So it's been really cool just to see out in like the world and in the wild.
Yeah, I use it on, if you've ever seen anything that I've made, not that I make a ton of graphics for astrology things, but it always has it on there. It's
Yeah,
so
and like even currently with the book I'm designing with Palace, of course, the IC, the Astrology of Coming Home, coming
yeah,
soon.
if you're on this podcast,
It
you know about Palace because Palace has been on the show and they are absolutely amazing writing this book that is
Palace is incredible.
their book is going to be so amazing. I'm so excited for it.
And I'm so excited too because like all the charts, and there will be many charts in the IC book. They're all going to be typeset in Fusus, just so there's like maximum legibility. I really took a lot of care to micro adjusting. I even like I think the 2.0 version, which I released I think a year later, like around the anniversary of Fusus, I adjusted even the things because this whole process of designing was really kind of like my debut into really stepping firmly into the world of type design, and like I adjusted things optically and graphically that I didn't even know at the time, to balance the form. So like you can tell based on the 1.0 versus 2.0, there's like slight adjustments that like
I am the
overall
person who went
contribute.
through glyph by glyph and was like, what's different and what's the same? Like, I'm that person who loved it.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. I mean, I love it. I love it.
And it was like just the slightest, like certain little lines were like thinner or like shaped slightly different, and like the little adjustments.
Yeah.
It honestly felt like such a Saturn refinement process, like little
Oh, it's
tiny
wow.
tweaks for the perfection and
Mhm.
like constant growth and change. It was so cool to see.
Yep,
Mm.
yep. And I think that is just true with the world of type design. I associate type designers, and this is like a little astrological aside. I really do associate the world of like type design as like a very Saturnine and also mercurial art, right? I think it's especially since like when you look at the history of typography and typesetting, you think of like the Gutenberg press and the lead movable type, like literally the metal associated with Saturn. Originally like books had to be cast letter by letter in lead, and so you had to manually typeset it. And in order to do all the things that we I think take for granted now in our digital age, we can like adjust lines and all and like change font sizes at will on like word processors. That process used to be so manual, and you would have to, in order to like space anything and to get proper line adjustment, you would have to literally sit there. Someone would have to sit there and like refine these pieces of type, which would take forever, but I think it really speaks to I think the lineage and the tradition of type design. And I think like I find it so I feel like it's such a privilege for me to be able to contribute to the world of type in such a because it's a very niche font, it's like like, and that's why like at first I like
Very,
kind of had some
very
impostery feelings like, do people want this, like do or is this even going to be a thing? And then when I saw the traction it had online, I'm like, okay, I think people want this thing, so
It is very specific, like, and it's a very, like how you said, like, it's a very niche interest, and it has to be like a very specialized thing. But because it is so specialized, there's like a higher caliber of like excellence that is expected and like desired to see, which is something that you brought that hadn't been there, which is so cool.
Yeah, and I think it's something that like is I think design to me is function, right?
Yeah,
As well as aesthetic.
the pod knows that you have a whole design background.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And so like I really wanted to make sure that the it was functional, and this is also one of the reasons why I decided to configure the keyboard the way it was, because I think like with other astrology fonts, I noticed that like even some of the keyboard configurations, it felt random. It wouldn't feel like it was laid out by somebody who interacted regularly
Ooh,
with astrology, you
I'm trying.
know? So like the way that I laid out the keyboard itself, just, try to make it somewhat logical with how it was laid out, where the planets and signs, they mapped in a way that made sense so people could access it. Um yeah, so it can be more accessible, which I think what fonts should be. It should be both legible and accessible.
100%, because it has to be, like you said, it has to be functional, and people aren't going to use something that doesn't make sense. And
Yep. Yep.
if it's more difficult to try to use it, and if it doesn't add a simplicity or an ease, because that's ultimately what it's supposed to be doing, like the whole process of typesetting is so that something's more legible, it's more
Hmm.
understandable, it's more easy to read, so that the information can be more smoothly digested and can become workable in your own way. And
Totally.
through that process of like essentially searching for legibility in a way that is like also aesthetic and enjoyable to consume, because it's not just enough for it to work, it has to actually provide something like of this almost ephemeral like experience that you go through when you engage.
Totally.
Mm.
Absolutely. I really try to strive for that in like all my work. I think it reminds me of like, I'm a Libra Sun Mercury, that's my sect light and my midheaven. So I think
That's
about Libra as like,
that. But how could we introduce you and not let the podcast know that you are another iconic Sag rising? Um, this
yes,
this pod runs on Sag rising energy. We
we
all know.
live right beside rising.
But yeah, whenever I think that that was a moment for us at Norwalk too, is like figuring out we were both Sag risings, and I remember looking at you and being like, "This is a homie."
Yep. Absolutely. I actually remember that experience at Norwalk so viscerally because you just kind of ran up to me and then we just, immediately connected, and obviously you were talking about fusus and how much you used it, and it just like warmed my heart, because when you're first, it was my first Norwalk ever, so you feel like reserved, guarded. I think like most people feel that way or in
Yeah,
social settings,
2020.
especially post pandemic. Everyone was kind of like, you know, and I just immediate camaraderie. So
It
mwah.
was also my first Norwalk, but apparent, but like I love that people's experience of me is that I just be like doing my Gemini thing and just being like, "Hello, we're friends. Did you know?"
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I felt so like, whew, I have friends. I have people, people aren't threatening because you truly,
Did you know that
you
you
know.
are loved? Um,
And it's cool because now that I've been able to work with like so many other fellow astrologers doing different design things, it was just like cool to be able to be amongst, it's such a different feeling. I think this is why like in-person conferences, I probably won't be attending this year, but next
mm,
year for sure I'll be attending Norwalk again. But it's just cool to be able to see that, something that you did impacted someone or helped someone in their work. I think that's the coolest feeling as a designer.
ooh, I actually did find one of the. I can't tell which version it is, but it's the keyboard setup. If you want me to show it,
Yeah, yeah.
because I love this little thing. Mm-mm-mm. Oh my gosh. Okay. Look at this little cutie. Ugh,
Oh, I haven't looked at this in a hot second.
look at how cute it is. And look at how well it's laid out, y'all. Like the planets and the signs and everything's just organized so well. All of the points that are included. Like,
Yeah, it took so long to figure out like, okay, what would make sense? Because this is actually before, and this is maybe this is a segue into like the next fonts that I'm currently working on and like are still not up. Even right now, Fuses is not up because I'm
Oh,
sorry, my website is under construction, but pretty soon, more fonts will be rolling out, I guess is the point. One of the points I wanted to make on this podcast. So like things are under development. I have a lot of projects on my plate and am notoriously bad at like getting things out on in a reasonable timeline. So
and also because
but
the refinement process is never done and Saturn's never actually done working through
it's
it.
it's really never done. And I think that's always the thing that I've even gotten this advice just looking at other type designers and who I consider like some of my mentors, like your teachers, and like a lot of like designers are always say that there's always a point where you feel like, okay, I could always keep going, but I'm gonna decide to stop here, and I have to do that to myself, otherwise I'll keep refining something to death. So I have another font that's coming out. I think its tentative name is Celestia, and it is going to be a serif font with a Roman. So this means that it's going to be an actual fully functional Roman typeface, but it's going to have special code in it that allows you to type like any like astroglyph in line to create like essentially you would be like MAR with a special mark, and it would basically collapse and turn into like the Mars glyph. Right. And so like you basically get to type in the Roman and astrology glyphs, and they're all designed to kind of flow in line together. And that was like the vision for like this next app that I keep calling it an app, this next font that's coming out. And it's gonna take some time to fully develop. But that's kind of one of the ones like I wanted to share that's under production, right?
I'm super excited about that one selfishly because I love a serif font so much. They are so elegant and so funky, and you can do so many different things with the serif and like the shape of it specifically. It's so cool. I'm so thrilled about it. Serif font has always been like so much fun to for me like experiment with handwriting and stuff. I haven't really talked about it on the podcast before. I post the pods on YouTube. I guess I should also say that this is going to be somewhat of a visual episode for people who are listening. You're probably going to want to pop over to the YouTube version to watch the video. But I don't talk about it on the podcast much, but I do have YouTube videos that are that expose my past as a bullet journaler and a
I actually was lurking in your channel and I noticed that. I was like, oh shit, she's bullet journaling. I love it.
yeah, she used to be hardcore. I do it now like digitally on my iPad, just to save paper, but to still get like the handwritten feeling of it. So I don't post like videos of my setups and stuff anymore because they're not super exciting. Sometimes they're cute, but they're not as exciting as like the physical versions. But yeah, the history of the handwriting and the bullet journaling and all of it has gone deep. And now, because I've even told you this, I've gotten into bookbinding as a hobby and like typesetting.
Yeah, amazing. I'm
And
obsessed with
so
that.
and so now Hugh and I have another thing to talk about all the time.
Oh, I've gone down that rabbit hole. I mean, it's amazing, but it is definitely a rabbit hole.
It is, and it gives you so much more respect for books and literature and just handwriting and words and language.
Yep.
You actually like put yourself in the experience of taking a piece of something and then typesetting it to be printed and then printing it and then sewing it together and making it into a book and then being like, oh wow, I just took a concept and made it into something that can live outside of myself, which is very different, especially in today's world as we move into such a digital age. Pluto and Aquarius, so
Yep.
technologically advanced and technologically driven with all of the AIs and the chat GPTs and everything being used and now like offhanded to something digital or technological to take care of it instead of it being a human experience, that it gives me a much deeper appreciation for all of those things, which is, as you said earlier, like very much a Mercury Saturn thing, like seeing the
Yeah,
longevity of an idea, like not just the Mercury quickness of it. It's like you take this very fast Mercury thing that's moving really quickly, that's just a fleeting thought, and then you end up developing it and it becomes this written work, and then what can you do to make that last?
totally, totally. And I think that that's why, for instance, the IC project was so immediately like I felt when Palace first approached me to and asked about like the IC, and we eventually had conversations that led to me agreeing to essentially design the entire book. I knew it was like I had like the grindstone beneath my feet. I had like this impulse, this strong like knowing that's like you have to do this. It's like, and it's be to like preserve, and carry. I think it's so much about Saturn is like, to me, preserving and carrying into the future. There's like this dichotomy all the time with the role of Saturn in like physical existence in the world. I think like there's the, yeah, I guess the nocturnal side of Saturn I associate with Capricorn that is all about understanding the land as it is now. It's about history. It's about the archival collected sum total of experience in existence. And I think the Aqua archetype, which I am, you know, notoriously, ascendant ruler in Aqua Moon. I think so much about this, and in my design practice is about basically drawing on artifacts from the past, and this speaks back to like, my experience in classics. I studied classics along with my design degree. So I think I have this deep appreciation for history, but not being bound completely to it. I think so much of like the Aqua archetype is so much about trying to architect and imagine new realities when you actually know the rules. It's like the whole thing with artists and designers. It's like you got to really understand the rules in order to break them. So I think like so much of like what I try to bring to my work is like really understanding the tradition where things come from. And this reflects in like how I practice astrology. It's like, do you know enough about the system in order to like intelligently break the rules where appropriate, to innovate where appropriate, and I think that is what I'm that dance is something I'm always trying to do with the fonts I produce. I mean, it's so weird, right? Because you have like this long tradition of astrology, which we know, which if you even look back at the Renaissance, I was like, oh, people were doing this. There was like, textbooks, of course, in the Renaissance that were like Bonatti, like a few like Lilly, there were like a few like really famous books in the astrological tradition. And in those books, they had, typesetters who would, carve, glyphs of like Mars and Jupiter and things like that. So it feels like, no, this tradition has been around. And I feel like I'm just giving it, through modern tools, like new life, so it feels like in this way, even in my design practice, I'm following this lineage and trying to innovate where I can based on something that my predecessors have already done, so and I take a lot of inspiration from like old manuscripts because like I do with all of my designs, I usually do like a huge research phase to figure out like, okay, what especially when you're trying to innovate on glyphs, because I think with Fusus, some of like the glyphs were of course glyphs that we recognize, but in terms of the images, like the glyphs throughout history, they've changed so much. Like the symbol for Cancer or like the symbol for like Capricorn throughout the years like have changed so much, and like just it's just like a cool uh thing to see, how the form has shifted and what has been carried forward.
I was very specifically going to make sure that the Capricorn glyph got brought up in this conversation, because we are both, famously Sag risings, but you are part of
Yeah,
you have the Jupiter in Aquarius, where I have the Jupiter in
yeah,
Capricorn, the other Saturn. Um, and whenever so like, of course, as like my chart ruler, like, and as someone who understands that it's a complicated relationship with Jupiter and Cap, um, I
mhm,
was very personally invested in the Capricorn glyph debate. For those who don't know, Hugh like posted a couple different versions of the Capricorn glyph, on Astro Twitter, and there were so many opinions. And
Oh,
as there should,
funny.
because it's a very polarizing glyph, because there are so many different ways that it's been written and can be stylized to look a certain way. The
It's
Capricorn.
so cool. It's just so interesting to see. And obviously, yeah, there were a lot of people who had very, very strong opinions of which one was the correct Capricorn glyph. So of course, I designed like the Libra I am. I designed all the different versions. So no one could get mad.
You have options.
Yeah, you have options. I also, and that's true with a lot of typefaces, like really well designed typefaces. They often have what are in new recent font technology, you have what is called open type, which is a feature if you are a designer yourself or use like applications that allow for open type features like InDesign, you can actually select different styles of glyphs in order to accomplish your graphic design needs. So if people, hopefully the fonts in the future that I'll release will have these features, so the people just have option, you know, um, so they can design and choose whatever glyph suits their fancy.
That's so cool. Ugh, I love that. And something that essentially that's doing is allowing, because like you being the maker of it, you're having this role like as a translator to bring this in, but then the people who each use it having options allows them to even more further personalize the way that they translate and the way that they express. Um,
Totally, totally.
I love that that's giving essentially, because by doing that, it maybe this is a little soapbox moment, but in a way, it's another layer of legitimacy, especially to
Mhm.
work that we do that often doesn't receive the respect that it deserves for its legitimacy. Um,
Oh, that is 100% my MO. Because like so like this is the thing, and you know, as like I think like my aqua side, I've always had the tendency to like root for the underdog because I've always felt like I was part of the, you know, this kind of
why
outcast group of weirdos, right? I think
am I
a
rooting
lot of us
for
are,
us? We're the underdogs.
you know, it's like us. Yeah, we're the weirdos. And I just but all being in design school, you're literally the formal education process of learning design in a formal way is you're learning the entire history of brand. Of marks, of graphic, of the humans and using images to convey and carry meaning, but also it's political. I think about this a lot with Libra, right? And how it is the exaltation of Saturn
You are,
and ruled by
let's let the pod know, you are famously a Libra king. You famously a Libra icon. You sun there. You have like you just
Yes.
Mercury.
Yeah,
Like,
I have Sun, Mercury, and my midheaven,
yeah.
which was so funny because it's actually some of the story I had with the IC, where through that process,
Mm,
I discovered that no, in fact, I'm not a because on my birth certificate,
which
I just went by my birth, but then it shifted a few degrees when I had when there was like that Venus Cazimi exactly on my new midheaven. So my midheaven is like essentially at 0 Libra, which makes a ton more sense, you know, with my chart, you know,
well,
and which also shifts my IC into
the fifth.
Aries, ruled by my malefic out of sex. Because when I was first learning Hellenistic astrology, I was like, okay, my IC being ruled by Jupiter, my benefic of sect in a day chart, does that hit? You know, I always was confused. Like, I guess I'm kind of, you know, privileged in these ways, et cetera, et cetera. But then once that axis shifted, I'm like, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I like midheaven, Sun, Mercury, in Libra,
Yes.
satirizing in the 11th house.
Famously a Libra king in the 11th house. And then we both have, because we're both Sag risings, we both have Saturn and Aries in the fifth house.
Mhm.
Um,
Yep, yep. And I
which
feel like so much of my work is so motivated by like that 11th house space that when I was actually in my 11th house perfection when I kind of gained visibility on Astro Twitter, right? And that was like really kind of like the hallmark of I think like that signature for me because it was so motivated. The work I do is so motivated by the other. I think like so much this Libran concept of like, okay, what do people want? What does the community want? It was also the same year I joined and was on the board of the Association for Young Astrologers, and I was their design director, right? So I think like there's like this 11th house focus and emphasis of the group and the collective that is so like core to my work, you know? And I think there's always a kind of like a dichotomy between like the artist side of me, which I really now have come to realize is such that Aries, Saturn, fifth house, and then like this designer side of me, which is everything in the 11th, you know?
Mm.
And I think I'm always trying to negotiate between the two because they feed into each other because they, you know, really technically Sun and Saturn, they're both fallen. Like my sun is basically at the maximum fall degree. You know, but yeah, so but they receive into each other's exaltations. So over time, you know, like I feel like they really come into their own when I just like, you know, get over my own inhibitions. Because, you know, I don't love even like this whole experience, like being witness. I'm like, you know, you know, like I usually am super uncomfortable being in the spotlight, you know. But I think like when I feel like I have a purpose or like, you know, I'm able to serve people in a certain way, it like really gives me reason, you know, to produce work, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, this is a super public thing because we're seeing you in all of your glory and beauty. But most of your work is that your work and your creations itself are always in the spotlight, which feels like a very like
Yeah,
thing of like, you're not going to see me visibly, you're going to see what I create very visibly. And that is like
totally, totally.
more the mark of like you and your brand and practice as a whole is all of the like art that you've put into it, not as much like you and your own face, you know?
Yeah, yeah, totally. I really, and I, that's intentional, and I've been, actually, since I'm going through another rebrand, you know, I think I, I really tried to make a conscious effort in positioning myself that way, where it's like, I don't, because I feel very uncomfortable with me because I think there's a lot of responsibility and weight with being seen. I think it's like the constant awareness of like the responsibility of visibility, you know, because you're in a position of I guess power, you know, when you're highly visible and you know you can influence people. So what's the responsibility that you should hold upon your shoulders with that in mind, you know? And I think I'm chronically aware of that, you know, with that Sun Saturn opposition. I'm like, okay, what do I say? You know, how are my actions going to impact people, you know? But also like, you know, the things I produce, you know, like how is it going to actually influence people's lives? Because I actually care that it's useful. I don't want it just to be, you know, something that is cute, but it's not actually functional, right? It has to be. I want to spotlight more my work than I necessarily care about people seeing my face per se. You know.
Yeah, it's such a mark of humility as well that you're like, I know what I put out and I know what it speaks for and what it carries, so that is what is important. um and it speaks to that like very interesting Sun Saturn relationship with the difference between like the soul and the identity of the work versus like the soul and identity
Mhm.
of yourself, and making sure
Yeah,
that you're still holding separation between who you are and what you make, which is a really difficult thing I feel like in a modern world, especially for anyone who does anything online and uses like the internet to like market themselves or uses social media in any way, which is basically everyone in the world at this point that uses social
100%.
media on some level of sorts. um and understanding where the overlap is, but then also where the differences are between what is out there and what is being made and what is being given to the world versus what's you and what's inside.
100%. I think that's essentially the tension in like that really prominent natal opposition I have between like the Sun Saturn, because it's always like, okay, when is it about you and when is it not about you? Because I think in design school, especially since you're taught really to become a commercial designer, part of commercial design is that you basically have to be um yeah, design and art as a service. So that means that you are essentially the style agnostic in a lot of ways. You're really taught to be able to be flexible with how you produce art, and because especially in the role of a brand designer, which kind of like was my emphasis in design school, you have to be able to bring to life somebody else's identity. It's actively not about you.
Mm,
When I think, and where a lot of designers can fall into certain traps is they start to associate their own identity with their own work too much, where they can't let their babies die, because and it also impedes the design process, where they're trying to insert their own stylistic preferences, because at the end of the day, so much of aesthetics and art are about our own tastes, so when I think a designer hasn't develop the ability to adequately remove their own ego from the design process, it really inhibits like a really good final result for the client, because you're trying to actively make something that is resonant with their identity, with their brand. So you just become the worker, the tools, the professional who is able to facilitate this process so that they can discover, what this brand is and what vessel and form it should take. So when I, for instance, take a client through a design process, it's usually 3 stages. I call it the 3 Ds. It's dissect. We first dissect the problem. We discover, what the value is, or what the identity is, and the core root of what we're trying to bring form to, and then you design, and then you create the form, and once you can break all these things down, you have a brand. You have a core statement of intent, and now you have the form it will live in, and that's kind of how I approach a lot of my design work.
that's awesome. Because then you dive so deep and you actually get to really figuring things out. And something you said about like how a lot of people, designers specifically, and I feel like people in general, like lead with the ego in that way. And so they
Yeah,
end up
yeah.
putting something of their self in everything in a way that could really become projection. And it can become
Hmm.
really just this transference of wanting to see yourself in everything else. Which I'm sure can then lead to like stagnation in the creative process and a lot of like issues, blockages, things coming up in the way that you're able to put the work forward. Um,
Hmm.
and also something else that you said about how like in design school you have to be so flexible, like it sounds like you're not really encouraged to have a style, so you obviously have to do what everyone wants because you can't be your own thing if you have to be for everyone, which then
Yep.
is a
I think
really
that's like the training that you're given, right? Because I think a lot of people who go to design school, they have backgrounds as artists, and I think that's actually like the solar thing, because I think I associate the word artist so much with more like the solar complex, and designer so much with the Saturnine complex, which I think like I have that duality within me, where like a lot of times like the artist archetype, they're so much of their work is their style. It's unique, it's distinct, right? And people come to them for that
for that.
style, right? And I think that's a really
This
valid way of like
this reminds me of like photographers
you're saying.
who like specifically have people come to them because they love their style, or like a certain musician who like we want to book you because you do a specific thing and it's like your thing that you've made
Exactly.
your specialty per se.
Mhm. Yep. Versus like I think like the Saturn approach, which is the designer approach, it's so much about understanding who the other person is, in order to design something for them, totally agnostic of the style that you prefer. Right. So it's like more about you're trying to do service, provide service and work for the other person. And that requires you to have that flexibility in your toolkit to, yeah, find the thing that balances, that makes sense, right?
This is reminding me of the specific concept of like the not self in a way, like the things that a person is specifically not. And
Mm-hmm.
in the ways that like our own self like attributes are often like mirrored back to us in others. And it's reminding me right now that clients as like a signification are given to the seventh house specifically
Yeah.
because it's an other person that you are in a contractual agreement with. And
Yep.
in a
Yep.
way, you have to, and as a lot of people know, but if you don't know, the first and seventh house, they make an opposition aspect, which is the aspect of Saturn. And it's the
Yep.
complete opposite of yourself. You have to step out of yourself and go to the complete other space to understand what a client,
100%.
what someone else needs, without taking any of your own personal experience and bias into account to be able to actually think about what they need and step outside of you.
Yep. 100%. And then it's so true in like when you see the work that I do for myself, versus the work I do for other people. Because like of course, like for me, I have a very specific aesthetic, and a very specific way I like to like in the color palettes I use too. But it's funny because when you actually go to my design portfolio, you see a bunch of different projects that are still evocative of my style, but they have a lot more variety because I try to show a flexibility and I think hopefully it's reflected in the portfolio of logos and kind of design work that I've done for other big names in the astrology community, right? Where like it's reflecting their voice, and it doesn't all look the same because I think that that's one error in terms of brand design, where brand design should not be about conformity, actually. You're it's about distinguishing. So I think unsuccessful brand design is when it's like, oh, that looks the same as everywhere else, right? Or that other person in the field that does this, and I think that that's how you know that your brand process has failed, is that it looks the same. And I think part of my job when I try to work with clients is that I really try to get to the core of who they are so that we can create and find something totally unique. So it really I talk about Sun Saturn a lot because I really see that it's both. Actually, when you start to dig into the details of the process, it's both. It's doing the hard work in order to find the core self, it's defining all the things that you are not so
Mhm.
that you can lean into the things that you are, and that's what I hope to achieve for everybody who works with me.
I feel like that's something that often happens with aesthetic too, is that sometimes people like, even if it's just like whether it's a branding or even just artwork or music or stuff like that, people are often, if someone asks like, oh, what kind of style of this or that do you like? A person will be like, well, I know what I don't like. And I know this because I'm literally guilty of this, because when people sometimes have
Uh-huh.
asked me, like, even I recognize this viscerally in myself because people have asked me like what type of music I like, and I will literally respond that I like just about everything except a very, very specific style of country music.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And
Yeah,
that's,
I think it's like a Saturnine trope, right? Where like a lot of Saturnine people, we just kind of we it's harder for us to identify the things that we are versus and what we like, and a lot easier to define what we're not, And and I look back at like young me and I'm like, oh yeah, that was my entire thing in like grade school, and like I was like, yeah, I'm not that. Like absolutely not,
yeah. Yeah,
So yeah.
100%. That definitely started in childhood for me too, because I mean, I grew up listening to a lot of, at least with that example specifically, grew up listening to a lot of that country music all around me in Indiana. That growing up, I was like, I don't like this. I don't really know what I like yet.
Oh
Like, I was like bouncing,
yeah.
trying to figure out styles and stuff. I was like, I don't know what I like, but I know that I don't like that. So,
And and this is like one thing where like I think it's like maybe the fallen sun Libra thing where because I grew up in an environment where I was like, in the middle of Utah, right? In this red ass state, as like a Vietnamese American immigrant, coming from an immigrant family and going to school, I was surrounded by all of my Mormon LDS friends and like this very specific culture that I didn't even know I was in the midst of. And then at home, I was in like this, conservative, Southern Vietnamese, you know, family. And like so I felt like I was in identity limbo for most of my life. I was like, who am I? So the ways that I could slowly construct an identity for myself or to piece together like who I even was through media, through art, through the books I read. I felt like, like a lot of like Aqua type, like and Saturnine type kids. You just like were like really lonely and weird. And I was like kind of antisocial, so I didn't feel safe being surrounded by a lot of people. So like, when you're watching TV or reading books, you're like, is this anything? Like you like see like a character, and you're like, let me try out, let me like put on clothes. And I think that's so much like this fashion designer, or like people, so many people who have like Libra placements or tend to be fashion designers. It's like you're wearing identity as clothes, and it's something that I have like tried multiple phases in my life where I'm like, let me test that part out and see if anything sticks. And I think that's part of the fallen sun. You're just trying to you try out different aesthetics and you figure out like, okay, is that ring true, or am I pretending to be something? And I think like that has been a multiple stage process in my life. I'm not sure I'm even at the end of it, but like I at some point you find out, okay, this is actually core. This is actually real, and then you adopt it. It becomes you. And then at some point it stops becoming an aesthetic that you do and just something that you actually are, and that's because I've gone through such a visceral experience of that. I think that's ultimately what led me and what ultimately really fascinated me in the world of design, and particularly brand design, because it's so much about like, who are you? Like you get like that's like the first question. Like, who are you? Like what do you do? And once we can identify that, we can create the clothes, if you will, for it, create the style guide, create the aesthetic, give you an entire wardrobe so that you can flaunt and look your best. That's really how I think about my work.
Oh, I love that. Because that's such a Libra concept of like putting on, it's like you're literally putting on an identity, but you're putting on the identity of yourself. And
Yeah, yeah, and like you feel so in your power when you found like the right outfit. You know, you feel like, yes, this rings true. And it takes a lot of time. Oftentimes it really takes a lot of time to figure out like, oh, actually, this complements me well, or like, I look really good when I wear this type of thing, right? Or this feels like it shines a light on this part of myself that is so true, but I've never felt the confidence to give it the spotlight it wanted, and I hope and I want to do that, for my work where, it's flexible. I try to be inclusive because I know that there are so many different expressions out there, how people want to express themselves. And these design tools are that. They're tools for you to express yourself.
mm, making sure that Saturn tool can give you the best like success rate for just being yourself and doing the sun
Yeah.
yourself thing.
Yeah.
It's so
Yep.
interesting
Totally.
how much of the sun comes out in a way where I think about this a lot with the sun having its fall in Libra, because a lot of the times people put on an identity that someone else is trying, that someone else wants them to be. They're being a version of themselves that might not be all totally authentic, because they're sort of doing something for someone else's perception or acceptance or appreciation that they wouldn't have chosen themselves. And that's that like sun Libra concept of like the you-ness versus the other, and being able to
Yep.
still intentionally express yourself without feeling like you being you is impeding on someone else.
Yeah. And it's actually really funny because I think about this all the time and understanding why the sun fall, it finds its fall in Libra and I keep seeing it as like, yeah, like I think like the identity just doesn't come from, it comes from like I think references and the social surrounding too in which you find yourself in. I think there's a mirroring quality that you have in Libra. It's like literally how you fit into society, in polite society, right? There's I grew up in conservative Utah. I was around Utah, so I didn't realize that like, oh, I'm in kind of like a mini echo chamber where I was expected. I think there's like actually a very huge Libra signature in Utah because it's so much about politeness. You can't swear. Like, oh my gosh, what the heck? And like it was like very, very, it's like exaltation of Saturn. It's like we don't say that in public. And my family was very much the same way. Like my dad has like an angular Venus in Libra, right? And I think that's why like a lot of the Vietnamese community in Utah like seem to assimilate so well. And I think Libra, so much about it is assimilation. It's mirroring. It's also masking. And for a neurodivergent,
I was just
like person growing up,
saying,
like you're masking a lot. So I had to essentially, in order to even essentially survive so much of my life, I had to just blend in. I was just like by default this like really weird person and kid, but I just couldn't let a lot of people know that. Otherwise, I would like be ridiculed constantly. So I was like, okay, just like how do you fit in as much as possible to not cause a scene, to be problematic, to upset people in what people's expectations of you are.
So, sort of related, but I'm going to mention them here anyway. I'm reading, or I just finished reading two books right now for the book club that I host, like in person, like locally with friends. Um,
Uh-huh.
One of them is a literal like YA children's fantasy book that I read in third grade called The Phantom Toll Booth, and it's
Oh,
literally
yeah, we were talking about this. Yeah, yeah.
and it's literally about like this little boy who like finds a phantom toll booth to like another world and has like this full experience of like understanding the human experience through a lot of different people's lens, basically. And then the other book that I just finished is called Odd Girl Out, which is talking about the patterns of aggression and bullying in girls through childhood,
Mm,
and how it comes out like more passively and not as openly, with like fighting, but like the passiveness of it and the wording of it and like the jabs and like the bullying and stuff. And it had me thinking
mhm,
so much about actually specifically like the solar Mercury relationship, and how like Mercury never gets too far away from the sun, and how like the different ways that we communicate though, can sometimes be very true to who we are and can sometimes also not be very true to who we are. And not making a correlation to any like natal placements by saying that, but it almost feels that sometimes people say things that are almost not true to who they are, like authentically, and that they're trying to put on a persona for the other
mm.
in a way. And that the
Yeah.
way that they're expressing themselves then becomes a service, like a lip service to others. Um, and yeah, lots of big meta thoughts about like the way people talk to each
Totally.
other, and a lot of how like the masking then led to people just becoming a version of themselves that they thought was true because it was the only version of themselves that they could survive in, and how they
Yeah. Yeah.
thought that the survival tool was actually who they were, when in reality you're like, this version of me is not at all who I am, but this is who I have had to be, and this is who I've had to reduce myself to in order to survive.
Yep. Yep. And I think that it's so much of like I was like in that environment so often, that in my adult life, I've had to do a lot of work to unpack like the tendencies for me to, because it turns into like people pleaser tendencies, which notoriously Librans struggle with. It's like you become a yes man because you don't you don't want to cause conflict, or you're willing to shoulder the responsibility for other people to keep the peace. It's like prioritization of keeping the peace at all cost. It's like, no, there's a cost. The cost falls on you. Like, so I think like that's something that I had to really, really learn the hard way, where I just like I couldn't keep saying yes. I couldn't keep pretending that things were okay when they're actively not okay, you know?
Yeah.
So
And this is one of the reasons that I've been very open with this. And so I have no shame in saying this because I know you won't take it personally, but like I struggle a lot with the Libra archetype, and it's my 11th house. So because of that, I struggle with my 11th house a lot. Like,
yeah.
has anyone not heard me rant on my stories at some point in time in the last month
You're
about,
a Scorpio girly.
yeah, a lot of fucking moon and Scorpio girly, and that Libra shit is,
Yeah.
I fucking hate
Yeah.
moon transits. And I was like, my father, one of the people that I loved the most in life, rest in peace, literally had the moon in Libra. And it was one of the
Mhm.
things that now he had a Libra fucking stellium dog. And like, it literally comedy that I've grown up and had such a difficult time being in my 11th house and just being around Libra energy, specifically because of that one thing that you said, which is the people pleasing. Because
Mhm.
I have never been able to do that a day in my fucking life. as someone
Mhm.
with like my moon in Scorpio and just all of my other placements that I have that are all like super debilitated and fallen and struggling and maltreated. And I'm just like, how do you do anything just to make other people happy because you're suffering so bad? And it's something that is like so like antithetical to how I am that when I see it in people, it like pains me to be around because I'm like, I can
Yeah.
see that you're sacrificing yourself. I can just see that you're doing something that you wouldn't do and it's going against who you are. And it's like one of the most visceral experiences for me to go through to like see that happening. And then even worse if I like ever see it in myself, because that's just like a vomit immediately. I'm like, bitch, you gotta get it together. You
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
gotta get it
I
together.
mean, I think the whole self-sabotage area of that for me was like because I have those placements, I'm actually very good at it. I think I'm very good at assimilating. Like I could because I think this is what made me really good as a performer in dance, because one thing also that 11th house
Let's let
stellium.
let's let the podcast know that Hugh has a whole dance background. I meant it at the top when I said
Yeah.
besties, y'all. You should know by now.
Yep. Yep.
Like
We
you,
have very like eerily similar, like things about us. Yeah, so huge dance background is actually how I got into college. I won like a state dance competition, and like had been dancing like throughout like junior high school, like was in like leadership in like my dance companies. And then I was also at like a pre-professional company called Proco, and was also at like a ballet studio uh by a former NYC prima ballerina. She opened a studio in Utah, and I took one of the classes and basically got a scholarship to that studio. And so dance has been a huge part of my life. And I think like that Libra quality of being able, it's kind of like drag, I think like there's this maybe it's a RuPaul quote. I forgot what it, but I think so much of like um n- performing, it's like drag. You're putting on a character. And I felt like I was like very able to do that because I just had this ability to mimic, to mirror, and also to assume a character because in a lot of ways, because I was, in reality a really insecure, kind of like nervous, shy person. I felt it's weird because people don't associate that with me because I'm so when they see me on stage, people are like, oh, he's so confident. But I'm like, no, that's a performance. And also when I think you may experience this as a designer, I mean, as a dancer who's like been on stage, you in a way, the kind of the audience blurs out and you kind of feel like you're not really in the spotlight almost. So and because you're kind of also when you're dancing with people,
Mhm.
it's like the collective. So the focus, although people's eyes may dart towards you, for some reason it helped me kind of get over my a lot of my insecurities of being seen, because I felt like I wasn't myself in that moment. I was like this character, like I was like, in the context of like the group dance, it wasn't really about me. So I felt more comfortable being seen in those contexts. So it's like the 11th house piece, the Libra piece is there.
Yes, the concept of like feeling almost more comfortable in a group piece than like a solo piece or something.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. 100%.
I fluctuate on that. I kind of go back and forth. It really kind of depends on like the dance or the style. I've felt that with certain pieces, but as I've like performed more and done a lot more solo work or like go-go gigs where you're like one of a couple, but you're on like a different part of the stage and there are a lot of
Mhm.
eyes on you. And so you just get, I don't know, you just get comfortable with it. And honestly, sometimes when I'm performing, this is going to sound so creepy. Um, Sometimes when I'm performing, I literally pretend in my head that the people watching don't have eyeballs, and they're like faces, just that like don't have eyes. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's not well, I shouldn't like. It's not necessarily that they don't have eyes, but it's more that I like imagine the concept that they're just bodies.
Yeah, 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 yeah. They
Somehow,
become like one mass. Like that's how I imagine them. I like look over the top of their heads and just become an undiscernible mass.
Yeah.
And I and
Libra.
I think the thing is you gotta like not look at any single individual. You basically gotta look at the crowd as a group, as a collective. And if because if your eyes start to focus on a single audience member, sometimes it can distract you and you get nervous, you know?
It can, but
Yeah.
I'm absolutely notorious for making eye contact with a motherfucker and pop. I kind of do and love that actually. That's actually kind of fun. But more so it's I shouldn't say that I pretend that I like don't that they don't have eyes, but it's more so that I and this is probably me just being who I am and being so body centered that there's a part of me that's just like they're just humans with bodies. I'm just a human with a
Mm,
body. They're all just humans with bodies. And even
love
though
that.
like, in those experiences, like I'm the one on stage being paid to perform, they have like literally paid to either see the musician or see me perform or see the show or whatever it is. At the end of the day, we are both still humans with bodies. And even though I might be in a position of like where performing, like how we said earlier, almost like that position of power per se, it's like
Mhm, mhm.
still just a human, regardless of what the exchange is in that way. And remembering that and like recentering myself in that way has helped a lot. Especially like certain gigs that I've done where it's like, oh, there are more people here than I expected there to be. So you have to even like center a little harder so that you stay
Yeah.
focused. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And it gets better, you know, because
Mhm.
I can think of so many times where like I flopped on stage or like I made a mistake or things like that. And I think like that it comes with so much practice, you know, like that of like being able to feel confident to perform confidently, you know.
Yeah.
And people I think like honestly, and this goes to all the socially anxious out there, and it's something I have to constantly remind myself that the person in the room, a lot of them, the ones that you think are super charismatic, who are able to carry a conversation, do all the cool social things, it's like it's because they had a lot of practice, you know, doing those things. So like by that logic, you know, you too can
Do it.
be that if that is what you desire, you know. And I found myself like going back to that and like putting in the reps, if you will. I guess I'm such a gym bro now. Like I think about everything is like you just gotta put in more reps, you know.
No, but that's
So
also
whatever you're bad at, just do it more. If you're bad at it, just like make yourself do like microdose that discomfort, and over time it'll be less uncomfortable, and soon enough you might even like it. You know, I keep telling myself that for anything I'm putting off because I'm afraid to do. I always tell myself, okay, if I can just do a little and practice a little, over time it will be less hard, you know?
yeah, that's like it's literally the Saturn concept of like one little chip at a time. You add one little brick every
Yeah,
single realm was not ever built in one day. And we have to keep remembering that because
absolutely.
trying to do that are just going to end up probably even more frustrated than they were to begin with because they didn't
Yep.
allow themselves the time to just keep growing and keep building.
Hmm.
Like that also because we were talking about dance earlier before we even started getting on and like essentially that concept of like constantly working towards perfection, constantly trying to be better. And I was literally venting to you about how sometimes it feels easier to teach an intermediate advanced class than an open level class because of the experience and essentially all of those little blocks that have already been built up in a higher
Hmm.
level
Yep.
class that you can, you know, like teach things quicker but explain them less. um Maybe that's a good transition for us to talk about like the translation bit and like the language bit of like astrology as a whole and design as a whole. um because I mean we obviously were mentioning it with dance earlier and like the ways that you are able to translate yourself into the work and express yourself through that. And how you do it with dance when you have to translate it through your body and that's your job. You do it
Hmm.
with astrology when you're translating the stars and essentially doing it with language and with font and like translating an idea into a legible concept that people can consume and can enjoy. um and this just like this very mercurial concept of having to be able to take one thing and translate it for someone else to understand because there is no like one way to say something that will work for everyone.
Yeah, yeah. It's really interesting too because I associate it so much with like the air trigon, because if you think about like the triplicity rulers, the two primary rulers of the air trigon is Mercury Saturn, right? And I do notice that a lot in like my as a super air heavy person, like two planets in Aqua, like three placements in like Libra. I like so much of that air, process is like really heavy in the way I navigate life. It's like you think about it, you dissect it, there's like all the possibilities, and so what do all the facts conglomerate into? The Saturn, right? What structures are built out of these micro ideas? And I think it translates over to my love of language. I have a huge background in like studying language and like studying how to not just language, but also the language pedagogy itself. Because I think, like, especially in schools, everyone and mom has like been, been taking Spanish or French classes in a traditional school setting, and after like 4 years, they don't know anything about it. They can barely hold a conversation because I think it's just like improper like education, honestly, and I'm such like a Jupiterian person, and you are too, where it's like, yeah, education. How do you actually properly teach? That's like such a core thing. And I think it's so many of the problems we see in society are because, a lot of us lacked good teachers, or good pedagogy growing up for key things that we ought to, should be able to know, And so I make it like a lot of my job to like be not only if my whole thing is like if I truly understand it, I can teach it,
Mhm.
right? And if I can't really teach it that well, that means I probably don't really understand it that well.
Don't
You
understand it.
know,
Yep.
you don't really understand it if you can't teach it, right? So I think like that the air piece with like the Saturn Mercury is, yeah, like so you have, I think Mercury is so much about the words in their most micro component. You have sounds, phonemes, words, but like in terms of the structure, so much of structure is grammar, right? I think like the Saturn provides the backbone for like the words to make semantic sense, like because like we know that in language, like for the word fuck, it has so many different meanings depending on how you use it, the context in which you find it is. I think the context, which is I think the Jupiter, it's like the cohesion, right? I think it's like that dichotomy between the Mercury Jupiter, so they all, for me, I really, at this stage in my astrology, it's like so hard, and it's like really apparent in our conversation. It's really hard to talk about planets in isolation because life doesn't work that way. There's
Yeah.
no, it's like it's a synthesis of all these different things coming together, and I'm constantly trying to find cohesion and synthesis in the way I approach life, in all the work I do. It's I always try to maybe it's like a sad thing, always trying to go back to some core truth, like trying to like what is the common denominator? How do I square the peg to whatever hole? Like yeah.
Yeah, like that's Jupiterian concept of like what is the bigger picture here? Like
What
what
is the
is
bigger picture?
what's the bigger picture, what's the context, how does it fit in with everything else? And it's become somewhat of a running joke on the Mars series on my podcast that it's basically like a Mars moon series, because just about
Hmm.
everybody who's been on has like a Mars moon something. Like multiple people have had moon Mars oppositions, which no surprise because I have that natally. So of course the people that I feel called to have on to talk about their Mars are going to have a Mars moon thing as well, of course. And
Hmm.
the Mars
Hmm.
are lovers after all, so whatever. And they fuck when they're fallen, okay? Don't. That's
I
enough.
love me a good fallen, like I love me a good fallen planet. You know that.
Oh yeah, like as we both have a few of them, so I'm like, we love a fallen planet. They work hard for the money, baby. Okay,
Oh
they
yeah.
work out here. They gotta grind. Okay, they never stop
Absolutely.
working on
Yep.
it. But but yeah, like that bigger picture and essentially how things fit in together, it makes it really difficult to talk about planets on their own and the ways that they operate independently because they are always in relationship with each other. A planet
Always.
exists
Always.
on their own. They're constantly in relationship, in aspect, sharing a sign with someone, in some form of relationship with the other in ways that make them all connect. And it's really like, and that's probably why it's so important, as astrologers, as translators, for us to be able to talk about why and how all of those connections and relationships are so important. Because if you do just look at a planet in isolation, then you end up with a lopsided understanding and just a lopsided relationship in general to the planets and to your own self via that, and all of the different ways that things work together. And I guess it really is that sad thing of wanting to see how everything works together and seeing the bigger picture and how it all works as opposed to just the individual little piece.
Yeah, and because you understand that yeah, there is when you it's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that because the parts are the mercurial aspect. It's like you have all the words, you have all the isolated nuggets and facts, but when put into a greater context, often a greater truth is revealed. And I think I'm always striving to find what is that greater truth. And I think the interest in philosophy, I mean, so much of like the tradition of astrology is rooted in these core philosophical ideas, namely, in like the Timaeus, like Platonism and Neoplatonism, and like this idea of like fate and the cosmos in which we find ourselves. Like, yeah, like what is that particular instance, or what is the very fact of like, the stars, and like their positions having some kind of influence. What does that say? What does that say about the universe that we're in? I'm always contemplating that, and constantly figuring out like, okay, what is the bigger picture? What can I learn from this? Because like I think it's the joke with Sages that they're always trying to make things like a life lesson. But like honestly, you can choose. I think for me, I'm like, well, what else are you gonna do? You
I mean,
know?
I'm just like, you don't actually have to make it a life lesson. It's that everything just is a life lesson. It already is
Everything is, because
your
that's,
choice to
I think so
recognize
much
it
of
or not.
our fate, so much of our fate and like, the natal promise, the natal potentials is that I just feel like life is you're here to learn. At least I am, I'm constantly finding ways in which
Oh,
things are teaching me things about the world. It's like the world becomes more rich and colorful when you simply start deciding that it is rich and colorful and engaging with it in that way, and so that gives me, yeah, like I just have like a lot of passion around the idea that like, oh, every single opportunity, every single person I meet, every plant, every instance, I could find, some lesson, even if it's micro, it can fit into the greater context of like, what am I trying to do with my life, you know? And yeah, that's my sad tangent on that. It's I think that's why I practice astrology. Like astrology was one of the tools that was able to pinpoint and call out things I've known my entire life better than any other system or any other person could describe, and once I discovered that was a thing, I was like, wait, what? Like, this can do that, like, it just becomes like, it just blows your mind. And I can't, how can you go, because I've had my flirtations with hard materialism and atheism once in a former life, but then
we all.
after a while, right, because that's what the problem of living in a post-enlightenment disenchanted world, where and this idea of like this kind of fragmentation of, analyzing things in isolation, which is like the scientific method. It's like, but nothing in the world operates that way.
No, nothing
Things
organically is that separate in the way that our highly westernized, like how you said, like our fragmented, our very individualized world sees things as so isolated. It reminds me of like when COVID was hitting and all this stuff was happening, and people were thinking that they're like essentially thinking that their actions were only impacting themselves, and the writ large fallout from that in so many different ways of people thinking, well, I'm just going to do me and worry about me. But in reality, Earth is an ecosystem that none of us can separate ourselves from.
and I think my Jupiterian resistance to even like online discourse, because we know that astrologers are notoriously mercurial, right? And I think some of the trappings Yeah, some of the trappings of I think the Mercury without the balance, because you need both. I think
Mhm.
like that's the true statement. At the end of the day, you need both. But sometimes, especially when I'm online, I see this tendency, and like, certain platforms enable this. I know this as, a designer that has designed interfaces, right? UI and UX. Like a lot of these, especially like Twitter, like we know, like isn't like Twitter have like a Mars Gemini or something like that?
Yeah, some
Or yeah, there's like some weird fuck shit there.
we
And
know that the Mars
I
Gemini
think when
retrograde
you
transit was
isolate people, like you isolate people and basically essentialize them for like 140 characters that they've written, right? And you basically project all these things onto that. Of course, you're going to create an environment where people are basically being defined and visually optically associated their little profile with those few words in isolation. There's no greater context. It's very easy to turn something into an inflammatory whatever when you only have seen, that small chunk of the narrative versus when you actually put, and it's very easy to demonize people when only see them in a very, very small fragmentary, for instance, if you see somebody at their worst and only see that small clip of them in their life without the greater context of a human being. I think like for me, like that's that Jupiterian's like, who is this person? And getting to know, and I've been making it a more mindful practice ever since, like honestly, all that entire transit of Saturn through Aqua. I think we really saw a major fragmentation in communities. I mean, the question of community, all that stuff. I felt it really heavily as an extremely Aquarian person. Because I think at the end of the day, as humans, we all want to be good people, you know, but there was a lot of bad faith going around by how we were talking to each other, how we were interacting with each other just by default, out of fear, out of anger, rightfully because of all the stuff that was happening in the world. I think I've just been more intentional ever since that period to be really hold firm to the Jupiter side of me. It's like practice good faith. And immediately when you recognize somebody is not coming to you in good faith, say, we're not doing that. I'm not engaging with you because you're not engaging in good faith. So I actually end a discussion, actually. You know? So I think that's where like I always try to inject the Jupiter. Don't there can be an imbalance of that where it's like you're giving people too much leeway. You're not criticizing them enough. I think Mercury's really good at calling out you know key things so that we can talk about it, right? But I think if done in an imbalanced way, it can lead to all sort of bickering, which all sorts of bickering, arguing, when really y'all are more similar than you are leading on. It's like the infighting that happens can be like Mercury ruling contestation, right? The contestiness. It's like, no, I'm right, well, you said this, da 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 da. But then it's like at the end of the day, there's this bigger thing too, so I think it's like always trying to leverage those two, the axis of Jupiter and Mercury.
Mm. Specifically, something you said about that, like Saturn and Aquarius transit, and like when Jupiter was there, because obviously, like great conjunction, Jupiter and Saturn and Aquarius.
Yeah, and that's my Jupiter return.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that period was so interesting, specifically what you're saying about community, because people were having this, like, all of these revelations about like what faith they could have in their communities and how much trust they could put in these structures that they had built or that they had thought that they had built that were like literally crumbling before their eyes. And also a lot of things, things tend to happen in communities that get large enough that once they get large enough, then things start to go sideways and then scandal happens. And then
Yeah.
how do you handle that? How do you go through conflict resolution within a group to like properly address the wrongdoings without feeling like you're now about to ostracize half the people in the community because of what you're going to say, and all
Yep.
of the different implications of
It was the mass cancellation transit. Like everyone was getting canceled left and right.
yeah.
So I think, and that really that the word ostracized, like that's and I don't know if you have seen this content creator named ContraPoints, Natalie Wynn. She does like she's a trans woman, does like a lot of really amazing content around like social issues and gender and trans rights. And like one of the concepts around like ostracization, it comes from like the ostrakon, which was like a old Greek practice where you essentially like as a group, you basically write the name and collectively vote somebody off the island. You know, like it's like that's like where the and an ostrakon is just like a piece of clay, right? Where people would write that was like the writing medium for in the ancient world, like one of the writing mediums. So you basically they had this practice where you would write the name of the person you want to like get off the island or like exile, and whoever gets the most votes, they basically get exiled. So that's where the root of the word ostracization comes from.
A
It's from
survivor?
this.
That is
Yeah. So
wild.
it's like such like the mass, you know, that even like the Aqua Leo axis, right? It's
Mhm.
like the collective, the mass, the movement versus the individual, the Leo, right side, you know? And I think we really saw like an emphasis and actually probably an overemphasis on like this Saturn technique of like exiling, you know, because
It was a
this
lot.
person is not
Yeah.
serving
Cancellation.
collective interest, you know? Like I think, and sometimes it's like that I guess judgment, which Saturn does, is correct, and sometimes it was severely you know, like it was too harsh, right? Which is like what Saturn does, right? So I think we, as a collective, people were navigating when do we ostracize someone versus when we do not, you know?
And ultimately, cancellation is not actually a resolution or solution. It's
It
more of a punishment.
yeah,
Because if you
yeah,
actually want, if someone actually wants to work for the good of a community, the salute community requires people. And of course, there are cases where someone has done something so egregious that you don't believe that they are allowed to be there. And that's, of course, well and fine. But sometimes, a lot of the times, people jump to the gun to go towards cancellation or ostracization, if that's how you say that, I think,
yep.
to as opposed to going through the more difficult thing, which is the
Mm.
communication and honesty and vulnerability and conflict resolution
The
that it requires.
calling in and the calling out.
Yes, the calling out and the calling in, making sure that
Yeah.
you are both making people aware of their wrongdoings while also saying, okay, now do better. Like
Mm-hmm.
if
Yeah.
people often, because how you said, like we want to believe that people are good people, it's like people, if they fuck up, they do. If unless the fuck up is again too egregious and too far, you have to give people the opportunity to grow from fucking up. But then
Yep.
that also requires the person themselves being willing to put in the effort to grow past their fuck up, which just requires
Mm-hmm.
all sorts of accountability and all sorts of growth and change that can feel, really triggering. But it
Yep.
also is what it takes to have a sustainable, continuing, lasting community that can work through hurdles and work through issues to be able to come to a resolution that feels good for everyone.
Yep. I think this is it's literally because you need Jupiter for civilization and societies to continue.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, you just need a basic, and I think this is where we saw like the like good faith starting to erode when we had like a return when Jupiter we had like the grand conjunction in you know of like Saturn Jupiter in Cav, you know, and like we had a lot of that. Like we start to see like good faith start to erode also within within the same time that all these things were happening. I think it's like so much of society necessitates that you have a basic trust that your neighbor isn't gonna off you. In like if you like you know or like steal your stuff if you know like if you have it leaving out, right? I think the society needs a base level of like good faith, you know, and I think that's what like the Jupiter piece, you know, and like I think like when you're calling somebody in, you're making it Jupiter forward where you're still kind of acknowledging your shared humanness or connection of some kind, you know, even if you don't agree with what they're saying. And I think it takes a lot of maturity to do that instead of immediately, you know, essentializing because it's very easy to essentialize people, you know. So I've been trying to, in my own life, give people more benefit of a doubt, give, I think that's you kind of need that sometimes. Growing up, I didn't really have a choice. Everyone around me were completely different people than me, and complete with different viewpoints on life, different religions, and I think part when we become too insular, which I think is like the opposite issue, when we fragment our communities too much, you don't actually have community after once you fragment it down to that stage. There is no community. Communities involve people who are dissimilar. I think that's what, it's like actually a really good healthy skill to be exposed to people and things who are different than you. And there's limits and extent to that, because if that person is wishing for you to not have basic rights, well, that's kind of a problem.
Right.
you know
We did.
so I understand that there is a balance, but I think sometimes, especially knowing me as somebody who I have like certain types of privileges and I present a certain way, I'm able to, I guess, speak to those who would otherwise dismiss somebody who is, has a gender expression that is more overtly queer than mine, and like I think the martial side of me always tries to protect my people, but also stand in like this diplomacy. I think, like, again, going back to the Libra, this diplomatic role where diplomacy is so much about like being the intermediary. It's like the bridge, like Libra literally being like the scales, right? Like you are the bridge. It's like the fulcrum, being the fulcrum between two spaces that are dissimilar, right? The intermediary, right? I've had to really step into that role a lot in my life because I was kind of awkwardly in the middle. I'm not Asian enough for my Asian family, not American enough for, all my like American friends, and in some instances, and so you kind of have to fit in this role, like the in between, right? And I think it's a privilege. Actually, now in my adult life, I've discovered that as like a privilege, because it helps me advocate and be the voice that is, in between, because I think we need people like that in society.
And that makes a lot of sense for you in your chart too, because like your planets are all like fire and air stuff, but you Libra is like the highest point in your chart, and like your sun's there, your sect
Oh
light.
yeah.
So it makes sense that like everything would almost like in a way like fall in line to that, and like serve that in a way. That's really cool.
Yeah, I think like my Libra stuff actually makes me way more agreeable than I otherwise would be. Like, I always joke with my partner, Jonathan. We always say like, oh yeah, if I didn't have all the Libra shit in my chart, I would be an absolute menace. Like an absolute menace.
Still
I would
are
be a
kind of a
danger to
we
society.
love that.
With all the others.
We love that you still
With
kind of are a menace though.
I mean, yeah, it's gonna come out,
We're
but
low key about
I'm very low key about it.
it. Do you want to talk about the deck?
Yes, absolutely.
Dive into
Been waiting for this moment.
Let's dive into the deck. So I feel really, really lucky to have been seeing so much of this process through you, even from like when it started, like over a year ago, and like to see where it's at now. And yeah, just want to go ahead and say, like, before we even get started, how deeply honored I feel to be like hosting you to talk about this topic, and also seeing so much of it and feeling so much of it come through through you over time.
Yeah. I mean, it's
So
it's
go ahead. So I guess the people should know that Hugh is making a deck. If you don't know, Hugh is making a deck, and it's going to be one of the most beautiful things that the world is ever going to have.
uh, you flatter me a lot. Thank you. But I but to be fair though, I really do think that this project is something of kind of like a magnum opus, because if you don't know me, and I think like most people know me more for my astrological stuff, but like I think my beginnings into the esoteric world was through tarot. I think for a lot of like occult weirdos, divination and tarot was one of the things that really pulled me out from the depths of my materialism. And I think that, I got my first tarot deck, in Barnes and Noble, the yellow, RWS, and I got it
The
from Barnes
classic.
and Noble and started just doing polls, right? And at the time, I was still grappling with like religion and all these things, and this idea of the tarot started to emerge. And because, at first I bought it kind of under the front that like, oh yeah, I appreciate the art, when really I just had like curiosity. It's like, well, what if this was a thing, So I was already flirting with the idea of like the paranormal, I guess, from my vantage point at the time. And so of course, after you use the tarot for a while, you just become shaken by how like loud and accurate it is in a way that it just gave me such a philosophical, every Sag has had at least multiple philosophical crises in their lives, so I had, a typical philosophical crisis moment, and which gave me, led to a huge deep dive into everything divination, occult, esoteric, and just like researching and like using tarot as a practice really regularly. So later into my adult life, when I started to really study magic seriously, discovered astrology, discovered Hellenistic traditional astrology, I was still obviously using, and a lot of practitioners out there use tarot and astrology in tandem as divination tools, right?
Yeah,
I
I did
kept running into this.
time. That was where my
Yeah.
practice started. Like I started with tarot because I guess technically I started learning about astrology much earlier, like in childhood, but I felt much more comfortable with tarot much faster. Um, it took a very long time for me to feel astrologically fluent enough to be confident to talk about it with people. And I know part of that is
Yeah.
my insecurities that I had to work through, but tarot just
Yeah.
came and connected so viscerally and so quickly that I offered tarot readings long before I did astrology, and then combined the two for a very long time before eventually
Yeah.
getting where I am now, which is that I don't even offer tarot professionally anymore because I had a very serious, sad philosophical crisis moment and had to
Mhm.
realize that I had to only do tarot for myself or just like for friends casually, that it was something that I was no longer wanting to offer anymore. That I was like, this I actually have to have as a self care thing more than something that I'm able to offer people, which was a big boundary that I recognized at the time that I placed in my practice. Um,
Mhm.
because I had the whole crises of like, well, maybe I lose money because I had tarot clients, and maybe I like end up not making that income like back if it's like doing astrology. But at the same time, it was like, it doesn't fucking matter if this is what I know has to happen to sustain myself emotionally and
Mhm.
spiritually and as something that I need to just have for me. Um, just to, I guess, give an aside, but I definitely resonate with that because I started tarot so much earlier than astrology. So yeah.
Yeah, listen, I honestly, when I was a broke ass college student, t having tarot clients was the one thing that like was able to like buy me meals. I was like, I like it gave me like some spare money to like navigate, how hard it was being like a student, So I was doing tarot readings for people. I would do like in-person sessions and readings. I would do like group readings too, where like I'd have people
Uh,
invite me over to their houses. Group
love.
readings, like yeah, so I had like a bunch of like I had a party of people invite me over for like a tarot session. Everyone would circle around, everyone, I just gave live reading in front of them. It was just like a thing. And also for me, I associate so much of tarot with like my third house stuff. So it was like just such like a regular practice that I came back to in times of dire need when
Mm,
I couldn't see the road ahead, when I could trust that the cards would give me a roadmap to take the next steps forward, right? Because and those times can be really dark, And now that in my more matured practice, and of course I'm still developing, I've found myself just using tarot and astrology in tandem. But then at times I almost like there was like a want in me where it's like, what if there's something that could speak more directly to the astrology? Because I think the astrological language, and I think a lot of people who come from the tarot tradition follow a lot of like practices from the Golden Dawn, which like highly incorporated astrology into the imagery, with with weight. He Golden Dawn influence, so like a lot of like the decans and stuff like that really embedded into the minor arcana, and like even the majors, they have astrological symbolism. So I think the astrological parts, that was really my true intro to astrology, was through tarot. Like that I studied, the Thoth system, the RWS, but even earlier traditions like Marseille, and I really, really stuck. Like the astrological symbolism just really was the part that really made sense to me. So when I came to astrology, it was like, oh, I already know this shit. I already know what they mean because I've had so many instances of what like Mars means, and just through the practice of tarot.
Mhm.
And so I just had this idea that's been bubbling in my brain about like, what if there was a cartomantic system that spoke directly to the astrology without using the elemental directions, because and the majors, which is its own thing. We already have tarot, but what if there was a system that just was almost like an astrologer's cartomantic right hand, you know and I like the idea, was just stuck with me for a while, and I was like, okay, I don't know where to start. So let's just and then one day, and this is what I started to soon realize, that like a lot of my art process, it became this really spiritually contacted experience where at first I thought it was like just another design thing that I can control, right? And like think and plan. Nope. Immediately, as I started the process, it soon became really, really evident to me that I don't have control over the process the way that I think I do. And it was the first magical lesson for me in like, actually you don't have control. You are simply the mouthpiece. And so let me share my screen. So this is the first image that came out. So
Y'all,
this is Saturn.
I am about to cry up on this podcast right now. If I mute myself, it's because I'm crying over here. Because I just need y'all to know how
So
important this is. Oh,
so when this first came out, like I had like left a position earlier in the year, working as a contractor. I was like feeling really, really broke, you know, and like my parents were living at home, so my parents were like really pressuring me to go find a real stable job in the world, etc., because I had just barely graduated and got my degree. And so this image came out, and at first I had the intention of the deck being like monolinear and reduced and graphically, you know, you know, kind of, yeah, like graphically reduced, because that's kind of like the design training that I had. Nope. Like this image came out, and it basically provided the skeleton. So I shared this on social media in like July of 2022, I believe.
mhm.
And immediately things started to kick off as I like started adding more cards. So Saturn was the first that really started this entire process. So there's
which
Saturn.
which makes absolute sense. Like, given your chart, given like I think, and this is something that
Given my chart with Saturn in my fifth house. Yeah.
like anybody who has, not just us with Sag risings, but like anybody who has Saturn in the fifth house will understand like what a deeply like rough process it is to feel like you are creating anything, because the fifth house, like, I feel like can often get reduced to different things, but at the heart of it, it's a creation process. And like
Yep.
the way that Saturn has to curate that experience to make it so, like, for one, it's going to take forever, and for two, it's going to have so many different iterations of itself before it's actually formed, because before you're even able to put it out there, it goes through all of these refinement processes. Um, and it's also just so loud. Like the fact that Saturn was the first one, it,
It,
it
and how I describe it is it's kind of like my magnum opus, my great work. Like this deck, it's like nowhere near completion, even though I feel like I've done a good chunk of them. But like it really is showing me like, okay, this thing is gonna come when it comes, like, it will take a lot of work and a lot of patience for you to, for the ideas to come, as because I think there's a lot of stuff in the background because I realized it was a magical process. So the things and how the astrology timed in with the creation of each one of these images, it was like astrologically relevant. And I'll show some examples today about that. But here's the final image of Saturn that once it went through some like refinement processes, because when I did Saturn, immediately Sun and Moon, like Sol and Luna, kind of came out immediately after. So
Mhm.
this was the first version of the Sun and Moon that
Oh,
kind
yes.
of,
You and I remember you posting these at the same time too. And
yeah.
it was right, like it was boom boom. And the two of them, I remember I was like, wow, they're so like in the ways that they are the luminaries, they're so similar but so different. And that was what I was
Yep.
struck by,
Yep.
was the way that you really captured the duality of the luminaries. Like both of them have this like illuminating quality, but they're both still such different ways of it.
Yeah, and like and it took me a while to even like define what the style was going to be. So like they were one of the first cards that had like a second pass. So this
Mm.
was what the sun became in it when it evolved, when like the image really started to take form, and like the idea and the concept of the deck really started to take form. I went back and I revisited the image after the fact and refined the sun to the state it's in now. And same thing with Luna, and like all these things had like astrological like relevance in terms of the charts. I don't have the charts immediately with me, but they were all like configured. Like for instance, I think the moon was really tightly aspecting Sun in Cancer when I did like Luna.
Mm.
And so like there was like I just got like waves of inspiration that, and how I knew a lot of this was kind of like a spiritual contacted process was because a lot of these images, they came out fully formed after a while. You know, the main initial chunk of the image came to me, and then I just kind of did it in one session for most of this. You know, for most of the images that you've seen, they're kind of like one session type of things where they're just kind of hyper fixated for like 8 hours, and it all plopped out.
I probably should have put a not necessarily trigger, but maybe sensitive content warning before we started the visual part of this. That if you've never engaged directly with planetary spirits and you are watching the visual version, you are going to essentially be doing that,
Mhm.
and getting a firsthand actual like experience with them, viscerally, magically, in a soul deep way. Because that is what essentially the images and the process that you went through are then coming out with, is such a direct engagement with the planetary bodies. So be aware of that. Me over here as I'm sobbing.
And so let me share an image of Jupiter. So Jupiter was actually the when I did Jupiter, it was when I really recognized that this was the style that I wanted to go for. Because at
Yeah.
the time, I was still trying to make things like graphically reduced, like because that's what my, training told me to do. It's like, oh, you need something that looks minimalist and all these things. And
That's
then when I did Jupiter, I was like, no,
stop. No,
no, Jupiter wants more
are.
details.
We are Sag risings.
Yeah.
We are ruled by Jupiter, and God damn it, I don't care that both of our Jupiters are ruled by Saturn, even if they are. God damn it, fuck minimalism. Like, I'm sorry, I want my cool shit, and I want my fancy details, and I want my little filigree, and I want my dope shit. And I'm sorry. I know that there's a purpose for minimalism. I'm not going to hate on any minimalists specifically because you got to live your life. But me personally, I'm like, I want more. I want it juicier
Yeah.
and zestier.
Well, Jupiter would agree with you. Like Jupiter, because I think Jupiter was with the first image. I decided that I needed to shade the images to give them the full depth that I think they deserved, and I think that was. It's funny that each card really had had a story attached to it, and I think Venus
Oh,
came before Jupiter, and she was when I did Venus, I immediately felt like, oh, I have a style going on. Like there is like a clear voice for the deck that wants to be expressed. And of course, like immediately when I shared this image, somebody wanted to, John
Yes, shout out to
wanted to tattoo it on themselves. So I was like,
John.
oh
We love
wow.
John on the podcast. John has been on the podcast before. We did an episode with Krista on tattoos and astrology. It was one of the first episodes, actually. So go listen to it if y'all haven't. Plug for that. But we love John on the podcast. And John, I can't.
We love John.
The fact that John has this tattooed is so iconic.
And yeah, when I received news of that, because they had sent me like the image of when it was tattooed, and when I received that image, I checked the local ascendant, and Venus in Cancer was exactly partiled midheaven. So like I was like, oh, okay. Hi Venus. You know, like I have, yeah, and once because when I do launch the deck, I'll have like a gigantic book that will keep record of all the entire process, the entire process, because since a lot of these images were digitally recreated, I have really accurate digital timestamps for them. So I've been doing the culling process of like finding the appropriate charts just to see what powers, what astrological dynamics were happening behind the scenes as I was like making a lot of these images. And I think throughout what I can say about this deck project is that I just had a visceral, it feels kind of like and I feel really humbled by it. And it has given me a lot of like ability to kind of contemplate what the planetary significations mean to me, because it is kind of like a slow initiatory process where every single image really taught me something, in not in like a, oh, like a theoretical way, in a very true like Gnostic sort of way, where I really understood the quality of that planet firsthand, almost like face to face. Like for instance, Mars. I started Mars in Utah, and I could not for the life of me finish it. And this is the one of the early signs I knew of like the inner powers that were aligning to create the images. Because like honestly, when they are ready, they come out in one piece. And I was like, I was starting on Mars, completely blocked. I didn't know why, but it's about timing. And what I found was like months later, I had a scheduled trip to go visit my boyfriend, in Long Beach. And so came over, we were hanging out, and one of the days, our roommate and him, we were playing this video game called Hades, which is actually about the Greek gods. And so it's like this like action kind of like slasher uh RPG, essentially, video game. And all of a sudden, as I was watching them play the game, I had this deep impulse. And this is how I know it's like the inner signal that I've now recognized as like the signature for the planets kind of communicating, where I started the deck in Utah, but I finished it while I all of a sudden I had this deep impulse to pull out my iPad and start drawing and completing the rest of this image as I was watching this video game where like it was like just killing a bunch of like mobs, and like passing through the levels, and every single time, because Hades, the game, if you ever played it, essentially every single time you die, you don't actually die. You get reset and go back to like the hometown, and then you basically get stronger until you like upgrade strong enough to pass on to the next level. So as I was watching this slasher action kind of RPG, as my boyfriend and our roommate were like playing it, Mars just emerged. And of course, it was an interrupted process. Note that. It was like, oh, I was interrupted from it. I couldn't do it for months. Nothing would come out. The image just would not let me make it. And then all in one piece within like an hour and a half, the rest of the image plopped out. And I was like, oh, and then I drew the image like in yeah, like within like that session, I would say. So that's Mars.
I feel really personally about this one. Yeah, this one gets me. This one gets me big time. Uh,
Yeah, I feel really happy with it. It feels like really emblematic of all the, because I have symbols in my head associated with the archetype, but I wanted to be like a balanced archetype because one of the things I really focused on in like the creation of this deck was create the balance of powers, and that's why the compositions they are really evoking from like my background and like my love of like religious art and a lot of like religious icons that you see from East Asia, but also the Western tradition. So it's like taking this highly symmetrical composition, but then also almost like saturating it with all the details of the symbolism of the planet. Both its constructive and destructive um, uh, powers in one composition. So if you see, the common theme with all of these images is that at the bottom, it's usually showing how it expresses in our world. It's
Yes,
showing like
I was
these
actually
archetypes show up, but the
I was
deity power is like bigger than the people. So I think the scale difference between the mini people and like the deity, planet, was the juxtaposition I really tried to aim for the
Yeah, I
planet.
was actually going to
For
comment on that in the lower corner, like the little like person with the shield and the arrow and what looks like an airplane, like the little details in the bottom and how like it shows because I was seeing it as like almost like the foreground background, like
Mhm.
kind of like the foreground like how you said like the deity, the god, the spirit, the being, the body of the planet, and then you have all of like the background of like the context of the life that they fit, like where they fit in our life and how it shows up.
Yep. Yep. Totally. It's like it's both protection and I guess inceptiveness of Mars, but also like the destructive fire of Mars that causes war and violence. And so it's like it's the both and that I try to really um put into what are these the planetary majors, right? Because all these images of the planet themselves, they are the majors of this system that I'm developing, right? So think of it in the major arcana. This is like the trump card, right? That is Mars and is its entirety, right? And when I was doing a lot of these, there was just like so many weird stories like that throughout the creation of this deck that was very apparent that like real power was coming through, and that's why I had to like really respect it I had to learn really quickly that I had to respect the process and respect this as like no, it's not just like a plaything.
Mhm.
And because it would like sap on my vital force, I think like there'd be days where after I would feel like a huge rush of energy as I was creating the card or the image, and then afterwards I would tank. Like my energy and reserves would tank. I would not be able to do anything. I would like basically be a potato the next day, you know? And so like it was clear that I was like being a bridge for the thing to come through me. And it would like literally I would have like physiological effects, manifest in my world sphere, that would be associated and resonant with the planet, regardless of actually what transits. Actually, in some cases, I was like, oh, I don't know why I'm feeling. Oh, it's because the energetic resonance of this card, is acting up, in my immediate space, right? And so this is Mercury.
We
And
love our little trickster baby. We love them so much.
yeah, I feel really good about like the overarching style, and like also the all the significations of
Yes,
Mercury. I really
we
try to
love
like
with the
embed.
hands. The hands are everything.
Yeah, like the manipulating of like many various and assorted items, was like because I think as an artist, let me just describe like kind of my internal landscape as I'm making these cards. Often I'll get an impression of what I want the image to be, and then I'll start, and then it'd be really clear to me that like certain items or images or symbols needed to show up. So I would like have to like go back and like, oh, it goes here, but then they they really do solidify and concretize once I like put digital pen to tablet. I like it. Some of the things I didn't even expect to show up, they showed up, in like a really loud and clear way. So this is Mercury. Uh, And what I found really uncanny was that the further out from like I guess the worldview of traditional astrology as when I got further out the band of because I also include the modern planets, the
Yeah.
more that you go outside of the band of humanity of like the basically Saturn's outer limit, I noticed that the images, and here I'll show you the image for Uranus, um
Yeah,
uh
they become
they
much
start to become
less.
more, they become less human. And I noticed that notably in like how the image wanted to be for like the outer planets because and it really provided a lot of astrological insight and like kind of direct personal experience gnostic insight on like what these powers are. I'm like, oh, they become more and more alien, or they want to become more and more alien the more I go out and step outside of the bound of Saturn, essentially.
Yeah, because Saturn themselves, Saturn's card has a little bit of that where it's like starting to become like almost like on the liminal edge of the boundaries, you know? It has that
Yep.
feeling
Yep.
where it's still human-like and it still has that quality, but it's starting to blur the edges. You're
It's
starting to
starting to blow out.
like you're not like it's essentially the sensation that like once you've hit Saturn, you now realize there's a beyond. Like before you
Yep.
got before you got there, there was still something else. Like all the way up, there was still another planet you get to, and then you get to Saturn, and you're like, now it's the beyond in a way.
Yep. And so this was the image for Uranus that, and this is, I'm telling you, this is one sitting. I sat down in one sitting for about like 2.5 hours, and the entirety of the Uranus image kind of emerged out of me. And of course, when I checked the transit chart for the time, the moon was applying to Uranus.
Yeah.
And like I had a strong sense like, oh, but it still needs hands, you know? So there's almost like this yang aspect of like the Uranus quality to project and produce. So this yang, you know, the things that we associate with Uranus, like this Promethean quality to disrupt, to innovate. It feels like it's in there's like a radicality, like the literally like being a radical. Like I think about this as in like the ionization process, where a system gets so much energy that things like the electron, you know, bounces from, you know, from like the Saturnine limit of like the, maybe I'm butchering the science of this, but the valence electrons, like this process of
Yeah.
like ionization. I like had such a strong, and I literally felt like static was going through my body as I was like, and I had like some, I'm pretty sure I had like some weird like technology weirdness happening when I was like drawing the Uranus image, and I felt like it was major mad scientist vibes. I felt I had like an entire episode that evening where I was just like theorizing, thinking about all these crazy ideas, you know, like I was going out there. I felt like I honestly felt like my mind was like getting a little unhinged. It was like a little bit too much, you know, so I had to like ground really something fierce after making this image. So yeah, it just felt very it's conscious, but it's not a consciousness that like is distinctly only human, which I think was the revelation I got from producing this image, that it's something more titanic, something beyond the human everyday scope of experience. And what was really funny is because Uranus and Neptune, they really arrived at the same time. Literally, as soon as I finished Uranus, I was like, okay, you're being really pushed to do Neptune now. I'm like, wait,
Mhm.
what? I just barely finished. Give me a break. But then the wave was coming, and I was like, okay, I have the energy, I have the downtime. Let's do it. So immediately out, after after Uranus, I did. So let me share my. Um, immediately after.
It's crazy because I remember you messaging me like right after this happened, basically being like, "You're never gonna fucking believe what happened, dog." Um, they came so fast, and before this, you hadn't really been working on the deck that much. Like,
Yeah, because there were some periods in this process where I just had like months of
yeah,
like
like you
not
like took like
working
little
on it
breaks.
because yeah. But then so this is the image that came like this is within like a 2-day period. mind you. So both Uranus and Neptune, it came as a package deal. And so when I checked the transits at that time, the moon was literally translating the light of Uranus because it had just barely perfected an aspect to Uranus and translated the light of Uranus to Neptune. That was its next aspect. I was like, you can't make this shit up. If you actually really know the astrology, I really, because I don't want to delude myself, So I really kept a lot of scrutiny on like the timing of all these things, when they came in, why they came in, and here's Uranus, and here's Neptune, the two together. They kind of have a very similar vibe, but like the Uranus felt like almost like mega yang energy, and
Mega.
then like Neptune felt like mega yin energy, almost as if like you could get sucked in at any moment.
Yeah.
And and I feel like there was like this dichotomy that I think is I've heard in some astrologers talk about it, but it feels like a duality that I was really overt to me as I was like I was like, oh, people talk about these planets it's separately, but like really they almost like feel like two dynamic octaves, polarities of each other, right? Where the Uranian complex and the Neptunian complex, they often exist in synthesis but they're just at opposite ends, right? The Uranian kind of like um out of like the cloud, the smoke screen creates the lightning flash, right? It's like the immediate distinction within like the almost like particle. I think the more outside of Saturn you step, it things get to become more quantum. I know that term gets overused, but it really is. It becomes you start to deal with like a type of physics and a type of reality that is way more uncertain and way more ungrounded by the physics that time follows, right? You're really starting to step outside the dynamics that are ruled by time. And that's like something I really, really got an impression of as I was making this image. And of course, I was in California. It was like one of the few times I'd visited, and of course, after having done these two images, I was like, oh, I feel so proud. Let me just go, like I looked up a dispensary, because I just wanted to like kick back and relax. I didn't piece the two components together, but there was like this dispensary in Long Beach that I went to immediately after I did the Neptune experience.
Slay.
And then of course I went to the dispensary, and of course it was a hidden back door where like the door itself was an illusion. It looked like a bookshelf, but you had to basically show your ID, and then immediately it slides open and it's not a bookshelf, it's like the back door that leads into the dispensary. And it was like the most like I guess like all everything where all at once cannabis I'd ever, because I came from Utah. In order to get that shit, you had to like, you know, do gotta know a guy, like, but like I was like the first time I had like the California experience of walking into like an actually like well-stocked dispensary. And then of course I got blasted out of my mind, but because like there was like some strong shit that I bought. So it
Hits.
was like I didn't realize in hindsight, I was like, that is the most Neptunian bullshit I've ever experienced in my life, where I literally went to this dispensary that was illusory. It looked like something else and it wasn't. And I got, some really good quality, cannabis. And then like after that, like I basically passed out because I took a couple hits and they were very, very strong. And I basically passed out until next morning. So that was my experience with like the doing Neptune and Uranus together.
The outers really came and said we're going to have an out of body experience, because that's something that I really in my like perspective have really categorized with the outers, is like those very significant out of body experiences that we've all had at different points in
Out
our,
of body experiences.
where
Yeah.
you feel like you're on another dimension that is not the human form that you're bound to in this incarnation, because that is
Or you
everything
just
you deal
become
with up until
hyper aware.
yeah. And you're aware that it's happening,
You
aware that you are in some way like spiritually separating from what's physically binding you here, and you
Yep.
feel it happening and you being connected to a greater power that is not confined to the same rules that you are, how you said, whether that's
Exactly.
gravity,
Exactly.
physics, reality, perception,
Yeah.
color. I think about that sometimes. I think like what different beings that have like higher forms of cognition, like what does color look like for them? You know, like
Yeah, and I really experienced that working with these because like Saturn was like very sobering. You know, like Saturn, like I think the boundaries, the outer boundaries of Saturn really ties you into the shared space-time, like consensus reality that we experience as everybody who's incarnate on this earth. But I think like as soon as you start to step outside of that boundary, things start to get a lot more weird. The consciousnesses, they have intentions that are outside of the scope of human understanding in a lot of, in a lot of instances, and I experienced that really, and maybe this is like a content warning, when I show the image of Pluto. I felt this like really the initiatory process of this, when I did Pluto, and how like like really, because when you're doing magic, I firmly believe that a lot of you are the vessel in a lot of ways. When the magic that you do flows through you,
absolutely.
your energetic pattern, your energetic pattern is embedded with the operation itself because it's a collation of the energy in the moment intersecting these weaves of fate, kind of
Crazy.
merging.
It's crazy that you mentioned that because I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but in my neighborhood, peacocks live here. Just like wild peacocks that vibe around the neighborhood. And as we started talking about this, a bunch of them just started walking by, which was really cool.
Oh my God.
They're not always out at like this time of day because it's a little hotter here right now. They're out in like the morning time. And so a few of them just like strolled by, which was super interesting to mention.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that. I'm obsessed with that actually.
Brought this up. So yeah.
Omens. So many omens. Like truly, like this is the most ominous process I've ever been on, like making these, because I do magic, like I have like an occult practice. But not all the time. But I think like this is one of the
The way you said that was a really important distinction because people usually like when they're talking about it almost like creepy, it's like ominous versus like
Mhm.
like if you even like try to pronounce it like differently and be like ominous and the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
more like an omen. Uh
Yeah, yeah. Where there's like
it's
I
like
guess
the
like shapes like
multi-meaning layer of that. Mm.
I guess like Jungians would describe that as like synchronistic, and although I tend to like, avoid some of those terms because like I like it's like that's not really a perspective I usually use anymore. But I think yeah, like there's like these just alignments of what I perceive as just patterns of fate and energy, because fate is like a constant weave of a back and forth, an intersection of energies, kind of ever kind of interrelating, interconnecting, and I've experienced it really viscerally here. And so now that we've done, Uranus and Neptune, when I did Pluto, that was the last, well, it was the last planet of the series, really. And re- it was a catalyst for a lot of things in my life, but it really showed me how real these powers were when I did Pluto, because it was with the first image that I did completely unrooted in on the ground. So essentially, I was I was taking basically a coast to coast flight from Long Beach to New York because I had like a work thing that I had to go to. And when I did Pluto, and maybe this is when I show the image, I might require content warning because it's like a really intense image.
Don't got the content
Uh,
warning.
it,
Don't hear you're vibing.
yeah, it's like when I did Pluto, I realized I was like, oh, it was in this is completely retrospect because most of the stuff most of the time I'm kind of in like this kind of hypnagogic state, where I'm kind of like half doing it, half in the world, half not, which is helpful when you're trying to like bridge in inspiration and stuff as an artist. But I was on the plane traveling like hundreds of miles, coast to coast on a plane, completely unrooted. And I was like, okay, to pass the time, I'm working on this Pluto image. Didn't think anything of it. Put on a movie. I chose Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. Of course, as I was drawing, I was like, okay, Pluto, drawing stuff was because it was all by feel. of course, as I was watching the movie, it was literally Wanda, if you've seen the movie, going like this powerful cosmic being who the entire plot of that movie was her trying to kidnap her kids from another multiverse and going on a destructive rampage because she wanted and desired so badly to be with her children and to kidnap her children back. And I was like, this is the entire story of Hades and Persephone. It's like the kidnapping of the desired, And I was like, and by a cosmic powerful being associated with the underworld. I couldn't make this shit up, and the image that let me I guess now I'm talking about. Let me just show the image again. Avert your eyes if you don't want to see it, but it's so this is the image of Pluto that came to me when I was creating. Yeah, when this is completely done, not in any localized kind of land. So, i.e., it doesn't have really an ascendant.
Yeah,
Like it doesn't really have a.
it's so wild how this image speaks to so much that Pluto, like astrologically, we think of it like generations, like the
Mhm.
things that span time, things that transcend time, things that have like wiggly overlapping boundaries, and things that we like associate with them. And the word transformation gets used so much for Pluto that it makes me kind of roll my eyes, when you think of like the almost like new age spiritual way of transformation versus the like the visceral experience of being changed.
Yep, yep, and I think like I really experienced it really intensely when I was drawing this image, and actually to get into a little bit more personal territory, when I finished the image, and I finished it, I was working on it flight to New York, and I finished it flight back. So it literally entirely, the entire process of drawing the image was completely unrooted, makes so much sense if you think about like even in our solar system, the weirdly elliptical, from the axis of like of the rest of the planets, it goes to such has such a weird elliptical orbit, and which is so far out that these processes are so much more titanic and powerful and intense, and like again, it has no association with the earth, really. Like I was completely not on the ground. I was like literally moving across time zones at hundreds of miles an hour, and it was one of the only images that had that, like it was the only planetary major that had that, so it like made me really understand what that power was about, right? It's like so beyond.
It's so
You're saying.
out like that we literally have had scientists argue about the fact about if it should even be included, about if it should even be
Hmm.
called a planet. That there have been so many arguments about what its classification is because of everything you said, like that orbit that's like so far out and different, and the especially like also the size of it and everything, and people for so long having this continued trend to underrate it and downplay its importance and not
Yep.
give it as much attention and not think that it is, as big of a deal as it is, and give it the power that it actually, and like I guess grant it your perception of the power that it certainly has.
And I didn't make this association again because most of these images, I mean, like, let's face, I think they're really channeled because I'm not a lot of this process for me. I'm a very like overly mental person, so I overthink everything. But this is one of these processes where I didn't feel like I had a lot of active control in what images came out. So this is completely hindsight, but once I finished the image of Pluto, I recognized I was like, oh, this dynamic, this power that we call Pluto, even though it's from a modern astrological standpoint, it's like a more modern planet because we put a planetary body to that power. But this power has existed in culture, and I came across this image and where like that the omen came up right as I was making it, and I came up this image of the Hindu goddess
Oh,
Kali, and
yes.
this this destroying being, right? This kind of divine destructive primordial quality of nature, of cycles, because even if the mala beads, which are made of the heads around Kali's neck, is representative of the cycle of time too. Because in Sanskrit, Kala literally just means time, and Kali is like the E is literally just the feminizing of the
Mhm.
noun. So it's like literally the feminine aspect of time. So
Yeah.
to me, the fact that it was straddled this entire process by Saturn and Pluto, it really gave me a deep understanding of like these are two facets of almost like time, of like all of space time, and like this in Pluto is the destroying part, it's like the cycles upon cycles, which is kind of represented by this god. And the tongue thing, I didn't even intend for that to be like a tongue,
Yeah.
but like this mouthpiece, coming through, like it's so evocative of like Kali symbolism, and I totally did it unconsciously. It was completely an unconscious process. So I really remarked at how loud it is, like this destructive quality. People don't often talk about the destructive quality of Pluto a lot, but it is like this kind of like composty quality of time. It's like entropy, right? Where things without when not actively put into order, things slowly decay. And I think that's really what Pluto represents when you look at the transits of Pluto, and because it's the shift in power, the shift in like these tidal cosmic cycles that we find ourselves in, um it kind of corresponds with the structures that are actively being built and upheld, which is represented by Saturn, right?
Yeah, and
And
there's
in
been great detail like paid to, of course, like the Saturn Pluto transits with like the Saturn making like the hard aspects to Pluto, the squares and oppositions, and like how that shifts
Yep,
things in time. Um,
totally.
like there's and you go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just saying, like in my magical tradition, like I'm a student of like Korea, and like Josephine McCarthy, and she talks about like Saturn being the grindstone and Pluto being the unraveler. So Saturn is the thing in reality that condenses enough for
Mm,
something to take form and to concretize into something that has form. And Pluto is the process that is the polar opposite of that, that slowly takes apart so that things can be composted and freed up energetically. So when things are freed up energetically, that energy can be moved around and used, but it can also, if you, this, I mean, the whole thing of like, oh yeah, power destroys, power corrupts, this corrupting, destroying power of Pluto is like, oh, people who are really power hungry. And because their inability to let go, they're consumed by the mouth of the power itself, And so I'm like, oh, it makes a lot of sense that like these images, and like again, very inhuman, kind of like terrifying when I was making this. And when of course my body took a hit, like and this is like a more private thing where I went I spiraled. I really had like a crisis, a personal life crisis, and some things that like happened, which I won't discuss, but like yeah, just like a personal life crisis that happened when I created the image.
And
And like a few days later,
let's not forget that, I mean, as you and I both do, because we're around the same age, like we're Sag risings that have Pluto in the first. And so it makes a lot
Pluto
of
in the first.
fatally for like my whole sign, with whole sign houses.
Yeah.
um, if like it would make a lot of sense for that to take a huge toll on you bodily after it
Bodily.
came through.
And so when I was like doing the image, like literally a day to 2 days later, and this is when I realized I really had to put a damper on like what I was doing, because it was like really affecting my health. I brought through the image, and then all of a sudden, like after many years of not it being a problem, like the latent herpes simplex in me had a flare up.
Mm.
And so that's how I knew my body was actually being impacted by the resonance of the energy and the working, right? So when I brought out the image, it was like, oh, like it, like my body got, took a major hit, and I was like, oh, it was like expressing through like, this viral. I really do. I've seen again and again Pluto activating viral type conditions in people, especially from a medical astrology standpoint. So people who have like latent autoimmune or like virus related like illnesses or ailments, they're generally going to be highlighted around like Pluto type transits,
Transit.
especially when you have the significators of the body with Pluto.
Mhm.
Oh boy. You know, so like yeah, like it was just like such a direct experience, and yeah, I think this is the
Along
and
with viral things, it also like becomes like extreme cases of infection. So like this
yep.
is almost where I don't really align myself with like the whole higher octave argument. But this is one way that I can almost see why it could be made a case for, at least in like the Mars Pluto relationship, and Pluto being like the modern ruler of Scorpio, which I don't like. Correlation, causation are different in that. Um,
Mhm.
and so Mars is going to be the ruler of Scorpio forever in my world. However, you see infection, like mild infection, as a significator for Mars, but extreme cases of infection that get almost like parasitic in nature are very much a
Yeah.
Plutonian experience.
Yeah, it's like Plutonian because it's like, yeah, it's like it gets into the stage where the body or biological processes really get into like the chopping mode where it's taking apart the cell structures, right?
Yeah.
Like I think that Pluto is like the ripping, the
Yeah.
tearing apart of worlds type of thing, right? You
I
know?
had a very I'll share this because I don't mind to, because I share it pretty openly. I had I'm not going to go in depth on the transits. I have it all tracked, but I'm not going to go in depth on that. But I had a very visceral experience with this growing up in high school and college, because I grew up in Indiana and there are a lot of spiders there, and I've been bitten multiple times by brown recluse spiders.
Oh
Um,
God.
and
Oh shit.
I had like a very serious like necrosis on my shoulder where my skin was literally eating itself out, and the poison
Yeah,
was
necrosis.
wrecking me. And like I still have a couple scars from it, like from the bites and the necrosis and all of that. And so like it's a very viscerally Pluto experience. Like that is when the
Yep.
infection becomes something absolutely outside of Mars. It is outside of yourself. It is now like totally alien in nature to what your body is used to experiencing. And so your body is now taking itself out, trying to take out the trash of just eating itself and removing itself and chopping down your very structure.
Yep. I really do think it's like Pluto has, I mean, a lot of the planets kind of, the outer planets have this quality, but like especially Pluto, it has like a very call to the void energy,
Mhm.
where it really is like if Mars is rupture, ruptures happen all the time, and like I guess like cutting and severance, but like Pluto dynamics are things that where the rupture has tipped over into a destructive wave where like things like necrosis, things like mass death, right, mass destruction, plague, those things are like very very indicative of Pluto, because it's like a culling mechanism of like destruction that rebalances ultimately, but through that rebalancing is done through destruction, it's done through this, and that's what Kali, and like these destructive, you look at the wrathful beings in all the religions, there's always a dynamic that's talked about of this wrathful deities, and their job, it's not that they're evil, and I think that's a very Christianized way of understanding these powers. It's it's not evil, it's doing a thing in nature, just like composters. There are composters in soil, there are composters out in ecology. So thinking about from an ecological model of the universe, it's like these powers of homeostasis and balance within the universe. I think Pluto contributes to that, almost like these longer breaking down degradation processes you see in ecology, in civilizations, in society.
Absolutely.
And Saturn Pluto transits, they, as we know, they will highlight a destructive wave and pattern and show the weaknesses within a societal structure, in an ecological structure, right? Where a mass, I mean, like we know, like forest fires or like a huge wave of like plague or death actually kind of opens up room in like parts of the ecology for new growth for to happen afterwards, right? And that's how kind of nature kind of cycles back and forth and rebalances itself, you know. And so
Has to come back
yeah, I
into.
think that's yep, into equilibrium. Yeah, exactly, into equilibrium, right? And I really follow a lot of like the ancient philosophies and looking at like even how the Egyptians understood this concept. It's called Ma'at. You know, Ma'at had so many meanings in the ancient, according to the Egyptians and their evolution of what Ma'at was. If you really look at from the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom, period, and up to like the more during like the Hellenistic period where there's like this intersection. If you look at these temple traditions, would you see the understanding was there even in like the East, like with Taoism and stuff like that? This concept of divine cosmic balance, yin and yang, right? Yeah, it's about creation and destruction. And I think like so much of like this process has taught me as a creative, the process of creation and destruction, of like, oh, there's a flow, there's a ebb and flow, and it's part of the constant celestial dance that we all find ourselves in, and what astrology is able to communicate.
I love that term celestial dance too, of course, like being a dancer, because it speaks to the way that like these planets, these spirits, these deities, gods and goddesses come through us and you and all of us specifically and generally as artists, as beings, as creatives, and the ways that we experience that in our life. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just enough, you could say. That's, I guess, to each their own, to like read a list of definitions about a planet. And
Yeah,
like
totally.
there's value in that, of course. That's not to be understated, because there is importance in that. But there's also the lived experience of engaging with the planet and seeing them work through you and bring you the understanding in a way that you can't just get from book learning or reading.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. And I that's my entire, you know, that's kind of how I approach my astrology too, where I think there's comes to a point, of course, you need to be, you need to know your shit. You need to know your sources. You need to like have a basic foundation of knowledge. But I think at some point you need to take theory and turn it into praxis, and that's very much my the way I approach a lot of things, because I think it was the only way for me to actually arrive where I'm at now in my journey spiritually and as an astrologer and how I practice, because you can hear all these things, you can know like this XY planet, Firmicus says this about this planet in the X house, but you got to know that when you're reading a lot of ancient sources, it's so rooted within, again, keyword, context, the context of that time period, the context of the ethics and the worldview of the people, of the political and societal, state during that time period. But once you take that knowledge, you actually see that like there's a lot of like room for like flexibility and how like things like can express, and actually when you actively engage with the planet versus letting the hands of fate choose for you. If and this has been the most useful thing that astrology has done for me in my life, where it's just given me the ability to see what hand of cards I'm being dealt for like that period. And so you can either let it express in potentially some of the worst ways it can manifest, or you can turn it into something and use it in a more active way. So it doesn't have to express. Basically, the universe doesn't decide for you, once you engage with it in a conscious way, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's the end of me sharing the deck. And actually, funny enough, I messaged this to you, but I guess the rest of the people should know this. I've Because the deck, has the majors and like the minor powers. Essentially, I want to do 6 minor powers for each of like the traditional planets. I was so stuck on like, okay, well, what's the rest of the deck? Because they need minor cards. And so I was, of course, when we had been talking about this podcast and talking about like, okay, me sharing my work and all this stuff. Of course, eclipse, exalted sun eclipse on my Lord of the Year, in the 5th house. It's a huge spotlight on my work up until this point.
Oh,
I was like literally 2 days ago, woken up in the middle of the night after a really long period of silence. And this is where I'm not even surprised anymore. I just now trust the process. I trust the spirits. They woke me up. I was just woken up from in the middle of the night at like 5 a.m. And then I was sitting there in bed, and then immediately the rest of the structure, like the minor arcana, or yeah, the minor arcana of the system I'm developing emerged. I had been sitting on it. I was like, hey, what is it gonna do? What is it gonna be? I don't know. I've been playing with some different ideas. Every single time I put a lot of effort into it, it doesn't work. But then every single time I just trust that it will come to me when it's ready, it comes out and it's like, oh, that's what it needs to be. And now I actually have a clear idea of what the minor arcana is going to be. Um, so that's super awesome. Thank you for being. I think I had to thank you a lot because I think you were the catalyst for a lot of this reawakening process that this deck has been on. But I was kind of like told even a year ago that like I just needed to be patient, which I'm not always great at. That this
Saturn.
its time will come, and I literally had like all these other projects kind of like on standby because they were just on standby because I just had other things in life I had to do. I'm working on the IC. That's taking up a lot of my energy, time. So I'm glad that now I'm starting to see like the end of the tunnel where like this deck is gonna come into the fold again and I can actually work on it in a serious way again. And now having actually an understanding of what the rest of the cards are going to be. So pretty soon I think roughly the tentative number is around 74 cards for the deck. And I'll be probably most likely crowdfunding it, hopefully with support from all the peoples. But yeah, I think that's it for me.
Gosh, I am bored. Yeah, well, honestly, it's just the eclipse. I mean, thanks to the eclipses for basically being like, guess
Thanks,
what?
Eclipse.
Yeah, guess what? You're gonna be besties again that talk every day. And guess what? You're gonna make the deck.
Yeah. I think because at one moment, I think there was like a test within the process of making the deck where I thought it was gonna die. I thought it was like, oh, and it was actually like this whole attachment thing I was like talking about where, oh, I was so attached to the idea of the deck of what it could be or what it should be and all these things. Again, me trying to exert human control,
Mm-hmm.
which how I perceive it is like me trying to, and then I think,
Because whenever you went offline, I think you probably remember you told me it wasn't gonna happen. Like whenever you like took everything,
yeah.
you're like, I'm not doing it anymore. You're like, it's probably gonna, it might change shape, but it might just not happen at all.
Yeah, I was in such a dark place where I've like I don't know where this is going to see a future for it. I don't know because like basically the contacts basically cut off communication. They're like, no, we're gonna go silent on you. You're not gonna know what's gonna happen.
Yeah,
And so I was like, okay,
if nobody here knows Hugh, like I and we many astrologers do, Hugh literally went MIA for a while, which respect,
yeah.
I gotta do it sometimes. But Hugh went like offline to the point a couple times I was like, you okay? You
Oh
okay?
my God, I really, and in hindsight, I really had to, because it was the entire like the gods moving me around, and we are like, okay, we're gonna give you a corporate job, and you're gonna work for it, and then you won't be at home anymore. So that was the entire process of that. It was like they literally had to relocate me, and it wasn't until I actually left that same job that got me to California was that when the IC. Actually, I was ready to design the IC. I literally had to quit my fucking job. Of course, like Kichu transiting my entire like all the Libra stuff. I'm like, oh, got it. Makes sense.
Got it. Gotta go. That's
Gotta
crazy.
go. Isn't that wild? I'm just so shook that like as astrologers we can like witness this happening in front of our eyes. Because to normal folks who like aren't like I guess aware of astrology, it's just a wild concept that you can know and see and actually even predict
Mhm.
how things are going to happen and form and shape in your life. That I think that's the greatest blessing. And just yeah, I'm obsessed with it. This is why we're astrologers, because we are super into you know
It's
looking and using tool of astrology to engage with the universe.
And
It's
in so
beautiful.
many
It's
ways,
great.
yeah, and in so many ways, it's the experience of becoming comfortable with your fate and becoming like intimate with your fate, and then also seeing where you have like the bits of agency to make the choices to do certain things, you know? Because obviously we have like
Mhm.
our natal promise, we have our fate, but we also have, you know, like some layer of agency to decide like where certain things go. Like to say that we
I
have,
absolutely,
yeah, like to say that we have no choice or free will at all would be kind of wild. But just
I agree with that.
there's so much more that is fated than I would say like the normies realize. And we
Then,
have the
yeah,
opportunity,
I think like
yeah, like we have the
you're
opportunity
saying
to have those places of like, all right, this is obviously going to happen. Now, what can you do about it?
absolutely. And I think not all fates are created, and even the, how the Greek philosophers were thinking about it. There are certain fates that are harder than other fate. Like when you are
Absolutely.
born, it's a hard fate that you're gonna die someday.
Yeah.
But like I guess like the where the agency is like finding what fates are harder and which fates are softer and how you can engage with those paths, within the given spun, thread that you're given in this life. And I think one of the images that really I was told was to set the foundation stone. And this is actually I this final image that I'll show for the series, and I think we'll be done, I think.
Ooh,
Is this image, which I think is going to be the card back. And this again,
I love,
before I moved,
I love this
I
one.
was I, so I was
I love
like I
this
drew a
one.
sketch because I was in the middle of like this weird process with my parents where I was like releasing a lot of my former life because it was like it was actually the entire eclipse cycle going through my 12th six, right? And on the day I moved to California was the day of the last Taurus eclipse last fall, right? It was on the day of, and I didn't even schedule it that way. Um, I was going through this whole process of basically letting go, releasing uh, parts of my life in Utah so that I can move my path forward to like, moving out and moving in with my partner and like, going and starting this new chapter in my life. And all of a sudden, through one of like the kind of deepest crisis moments within that process, because there's a lot of, change grief that I feel like I had to midwife some of my parents through because, it's not expected as in other cultures for, I guess, Vietnamese family to like move away unless you're getting married, and things like that. So it was like a whole process of like unraveling that I had to do with that side of me now that I've decided and formally told them that I'm moving out of the house
Yeah.
for the first time in my life, which is like normal and healthy. And somewhere somehow I got a visceral image as I was like feeling really emotional, and then I got an image of these beings emerging out of the clouds, and out of those clouds kind of formed the a wheel. And it looked like the almost like the wheel of fortune to me, honestly. And it was like spinning and spinning. And these beings, they were like made of clouds, and they start to take form into more humanoid form. And they were like playing with their hands in like basically almost like cat's cradle or like weaving or knitting, and like kind of the clouds start to form the spokes of the wheel. And I just saw that flash vision like so viscerally in my head, and I sketched it. And I sketched it out so I could have a copy of that baseline template of like what it was. And I didn't know where it fit in the structure. I was like, where does this go? This is not part of the structure. And then when
It's
I
the
asked that question, another flash image of like this card dropping down and then it turning to the back. And
back.
I was like, again, I was just like, okay, I think this is good back. But then I tried to really work on it, but I was still in Utah. And it was like, nope, you're not gonna get any insight on how to complete this image. You're just gonna get the template of that sketch. So I held on to the sketch. And then of course, as soon as I left my job, after working for several more months, this was like I would say almost a year ago, coming up to a year, like when I got the initial sketch. And then I think basically a couple months ago, the inner light started to come up again, and that image of the sketch that I had. And then I was working on it, and mind you, during this entire time, my partner, like Jonathan, he had been like knitting and weaving and like learning how to like, and I was learning so much about like fiber crafts from him because like he walks like a druid path, and one of the things that he has been working on is like uh creating his own clothes, and through that process, um, learning how to like weave and the history of like clothes and clothes production, right?
We love
And I
Jonathan. We love Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan's
Jonathan.
amazing. And so this idea of like the fate weavers, came up, and we watched like Wheel of Time, which was like a huge like thing together, so it's like again like all these concepts of weaving goddesses, and its impact throughout history, and then bam, this image emerged, fully complete, and I think this image is going to be probably the card back for this entire deck, and this
100%.
one is the most.
We love the team. Ugh, we
So
love
this
the
is the yeah. So this is the yeah. This was probably the most complicated image I've ever drawn because it had the most components to it. But yeah, I think this is gonna be the back for
say
this.
I love the specific Capricorn glyph that you included on this because we talked
Oh yeah, I
about glyph earlier, so I gotta just loop back to that and say I really like the Capricorn glyph on this.
I'm glad. And this one, oh, yeah, it really took a really long time compared to all the other images. I was very used to things coming out in like one session. This took like a week to draw,
Yeah.
also because I had a balance between like other work and stuff like that. And to be fair, that's good because I was kind of on like a manic sprint, which is kind of the spirits were like, yo, you need to calm down,
Yo,
like like so yeah. So this is I think that's about it.
it's beautiful. Oh my gosh. I would ask you to like tell the people like where to find you and stuff, but you literally are like, I'm ephemeral. I don't exist anywhere right now. But you do have
So
a website.
when it's ready, I will be back on Hugh Tran Astro. I'm actually as we speak, I am in the process of going through like and redoing a lot of my website. So once it is ready, on my social handle, I'm like Hugh Tran Astro everywhere. So I guess people can find me there. So once I am ready, you can find me on at
Because like
HughTranAstro.com. And
a good,
meanwhile, at Hugh Tran Astro on Threads, Instagram, etc.
yeah, like a good sad,
Still not.
nice and loud and vibrant, and everyone will know once it's back.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh my gosh. I can't even express what an honor it's been to have you on the show and to host you.
Thank you so
You
much for
already,
having me on. It's been a blast. You're amazing. I love you.
yeah, I
It's
was about to say,
been
you know, I love you. I'm gonna
yeah,
be in your
yeah.
inbox later tonight.
All the vibes, all the good things.
I'm oh yeah, I if you've been with us this whole time, you're a rock star and you have just witnessed
Truly.
greatness. Truly you have to wow, it's so wild that an ambulance just drove by my house just now. That was wild because I was literally thinking, I was like, oh wow, I'm gonna have to do the Mars thing and like end the podcast and like sever the end of the recording. That's like literally what I just thought. And then an
Yeah.
ambulance.
Truly.
So, ugh. See, and this is like where astrology and magic are like not actually separate at all, if you think about it, really. Because
Yeah.
everything, because the omens are always
I started out as a magician, before I was an astrologer. So to me, they're one of the same. Yeah. They
yep.
flow.
If you were doing spell work as a kid, with your mud pies and you were mixing up potions, then yeah, it all goes pretty deep.
Oh, I was 1,000% making potions in the sink. Like, yeah, just mixing all the things, finding all the weird shit in the yard, making little stone circles. 100%, I was that kid.
Yeah, you gotta be like that's where it all begins. The
You have
very
to be like us in adulthood.
no, yeah, like it actually. If you look at that, you're like, in fact, everything tracks.
Yep.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Hugh, thank you so much. I love you so much. Thank you for listening or watching. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being funky. And I will see you next time our fates weave together.